Lisa was sitting at the window of her small apartment, looking out at the quiet suburban landscape. It was early morning, and the sun was just beginning to rise, illuminating the streets, trees and neighboring houses with a soft golden light. The birds outside the window had long since begun their morning roll call, but this calmness was deceptive. Lisa didn't feel so calm inside. Rather, on the contrary, her life, at first glance serene and ordinary, increasingly resembled a protracted dead end from which there was no way out. Her husband, Mark, was lying in the bedroom, deep in a deep sleep. From time to time, Lisa could hear him turning over in his sleep, making light, snoring sounds that she had long been used to. They had been married for 7 years, 7 long years, during which a lot has changed. At first, their relationship seemed perfect, full of passion, plans for the future and dreams of a family. But gradually it all began to melt, like snow at the beginning of spring. Those warm moments that were between them were replaced by routine, conversations about everyday trifles, and rare moments of intimacy that did not bring Lisa more joy. It all started unnoticed. At first, she simply did not notice the minor flaws in the relationship, blaming it on stress, work and life in general. Mark has always been an ambitious and hard-working man, building a career in a local construction company. At the beginning of their marriage, Lisa even liked his tenacity, determination, and desire to provide them with a good life. He came home tired, but he always tried to find time for her. But the further he went, the more his work absorbed him. He began to spend more time on construction sites and in the office, and at home he was like a shadow of himself, always tired, immersed in his own thoughts. Their conversations became short and shallow. She asked him how his day was, and he answered in monosyllabic phrases, after which he went to the sofa to watch TV. Lisa tried. I honestly tried to get back what they had before. She tried to talk to him about her feelings, about how she missed his attention, but her words were drowned in silence, like hitting a wall. Mark has never been a man who opens up easily. He listened to her, but his answer was always the same: he was working for them, for the future, so that they would have everything they needed. And Lisa was trying to figure it out. But the more she tried, the more she felt that she was losing not only him, but also herself. When they first got married, Lisa had a lot of dreams. She thought about the children, how they would raise them together, walk in the park, go on family picnics. But now she wasn't sure if she even wanted to. Will she be able to raise children with a man who seems to have lost all interest in her? And will she be able to feel something real again, and not just live in a marriage out of habit? It was at this point in her life that Josh began to play a big role again. Josh was her childhood friend. They had known each other since they were 10 years old. They went to the same school, played on the same basketball team, and always supported each other. At the time when Lisa was just starting to date Mark, Josh was a kind of advisor for her, a person to whom she could tell about all her experiences and fears. He was never the one to condemn her or say anything inappropriate. On the contrary, he always found the right words to support her. But since she got married, their communication has gradually become less frequent. Josh moved to another city for work, and although they occasionally called and corresponded, their meetings became rare. However, everything has changed in the last few months. Josh returned to their town and their communication resumed. He began to visit Lisa and Mark often, staying with them overnight when he needed to be in town. Mark, oddly enough, did not object to this. She and Josh were friends too, although not as close as Josh and Lisa. For Mark, Josh was just a friend of his wife, with whom they sometimes had common topics of conversation. It was with Josh's return that Lisa began to notice something strange. Every time he came, her heart started beating a little faster. She couldn't explain it, but his presence comforted her. It was easy with him. They could talk about everything without fear that their conversation would turn into a quarrel or misunderstanding. And more importantly, Josh always noticed her. He noticed when she was sad, when something was bothering her. He asked questions, listened to her, gave her advice. And with each of his visits, Lisa felt that something more than just friendship was emerging between them. One evening, when Mark was late at work again, Lisa and Josh were sitting on the couch chatting about old times. The conversation began with nostalgia. They recalled their school years, their childhood pranks, how they ran away from lessons together to go to the river. But gradually the topic of conversation changed. Josh suddenly asked Lisa how she was doing, and not just superficially, but as if he wanted to find out what was really going on in her life.
Liz, are you okay? Honestly.
These words took her by surprise. She froze for a moment, trying to think of an answer, but she knew she couldn't lie to him. Her eyes met his, and at that moment she felt that she could tell him everything that had accumulated in her soul.
I don't know, Josh. That's it. Not like that. I just don't feel happy.
This confession hung in the air. She knew she couldn't say more, couldn't tell him everything that was going through her head, but even those few words were already hard to come by. In response, Josh just nodded, not trying to interrupt her or immediately give her advice. He just sat next to her, listening to her, and there was more support in his silence than in the thousands of words Mark could have uttered. Since then, their communication has been different. Every time Josh came to visit, they spent more and more time together, discussing her life, her feelings, her confusion. Deep down, Lisa began to realize that something was changing between them, but she tried not to attach importance to it. She loved Mark, or at least wanted to believe that she still loved him. But every day her feelings became more confused. Lisa tried to convince herself that this was just a crisis in a relationship that would soon pass. But when Josh was around, her thoughts kept coming back to him. She noticed how she began to wait for his visits, how her heart began to beat faster when he rang the doorbell. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, something new. Josh was standing on the doorstep of their apartment again, smiling at Lisa with his good-natured, slightly sly smile. His dark eyes sparkled, and his tall, athletic silhouette filled the entire door frame. Lisa always thought that he should become a model or an actor, but Josh never aspired to that. He was a man who appreciated simplicity in life, and this always set him apart from others. How she had missed that lightness lately. He appeared in her life like a warm breeze after a long winter, bringing with him long-forgotten emotions, ease of communication, and a sense of security.
Well, hello, Josh said with a slight grin, and his voice seemed to warm everything around him.
Lisa stepped back, letting him in, and, without noticing it, felt a pleasant excitement. In recent months, he has become a frequent visitor to their house. Josh needed temporary housing while his apartment in the new city was being renovated, and he and Mark offered him to stay with them for the night when he was in town. At first it seemed like a simple friendly help. Lisa and Mark had long been used to the fact that Josh could suddenly appear with a suitcase in his hands if he had to wait out a night or two. But each time his visits became more frequent, and Lisa began to notice that she was looking forward to these meetings. The memories of his childhood, of how they grew up together, seemed magical to her now. Josh had been her friend for as long as she could remember. They were inseparable at school, played on the same basketball team together, and could always count on each other in difficult moments. The moment Josh moved to another city for work, Lisa felt as if she had lost a part of her soul, and even though life went on, she always missed him. Now, with his return, everything seemed to be in its place again, although not as it had been before. There was more to his presence than just friendship. She could feel it in every move he made, every look he gave her, even though they were both silent about it. It was like a forbidden fruit, a desire that they both tried to suppress, but it only grew. Josh placed his suitcase next to the couch in the living room, where he usually stayed overnight. Mark, as always, was not at home. He was late at work again. It became a familiar scene. Lisa and Josh were sitting in the kitchen, talking about life, work, past and future, while Mark was busy with his construction projects. Lisa did not blame her husband for his busy schedule, but dissatisfaction was brewing inside her. One thought nagged at her. Why did she feel more alive in Josh's presence than around Mark?
How's Mark? Does he still disappear at work?
Yes, work comes first, as always.
Lisa shrugged, trying to make her voice light, but her answer sounded much more gloomy than she had planned. Josh nodded, frowning slightly. He always understood her perfectly. Maybe because they had known each other for so long, or maybe because there had always been this invisible bond between them that was getting stronger every day. Even at school, Lisa could see how Josh was always attentive to her mood, and even now, years later, this has not changed. She knew it was wrong. She knew she had to focus on her relationship with Mark, but every time Josh was around, her feelings got out of control. It was like chemistry, unpredictable and dangerous, but at the same time alluring. They tried to keep their distance, tried not to go too far, but that distance was getting smaller. One evening, after one of these visits, Lisa sat on the couch for a long time, listening to the sounds outside the window. Josh walked away, leaving her with thoughts that were like splinters digging into her mind. She was thinking about how things had become so confusing. She loved Mark, or at least loved him before. They were building a life together, and she couldn't just erase those years. But her feelings for Josh were bothering her. It wasn't just an impulse or a temporary infatuation every day. She became more and more aware that she was attracted to him like a magnet. Josh reappeared on the horizon when she needed it most, but also became her biggest temptation. It was easy with him. They could talk for hours, laugh, and remember their childhood. His presence made her forget about all the problems, about the emptiness that had settled in her marriage. With Mark, it was different. Their conversations were limited to everyday details: what to buy at the store, what to cook for dinner, who will pick up the car from the inspection. Those rare moments of intimacy that they still shared did not bring the same joy and satisfaction as before. Mark became like a stranger to her. Lisa looked at Josh as they sat on the couch for the next time, and couldn't stop noticing how his hand accidentally touched hers, how his eyes lingered on her face a little longer than usual. It was all a quiet but powerful reminder that their friendship was no longer just a friendship. One day, when they were sitting in the kitchen again, Josh suddenly started talking about his personal life. He said that he is not dating anyone now, that all his past relationships ended unsuccessfully. Lisa listened to him, but one thought flashed through her head. Why does she feel jealous? Why is she so moved by this? Josh was her friend, and she shouldn't have felt that way. But the fact remained that her heart was beating faster when he was around, and she couldn't ignore it.
You know, Liz, sometimes I feel like I still haven't found the person I'd like to spend the rest of my life with.
And when do you think you'll find it?
She tried to make her voice carefree, but something inside her seemed to tremble. Josh looked at her thoughtfully, and there was a strange sadness in his eyes. He didn't answer right away, but his silence said more than any words. Lisa felt a tense silence between them, full of understatement. These moments had become more and more frequent. Every time Josh was around, Lisa felt like something was brewing between them, something that couldn't be ignored. And even though she tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, inside she knew the truth: her feelings for Josh had become too strong to just dismiss them. This internal struggle was tearing her apart. On the one hand, she loved Mark. He was her husband, and they were building a life together full of joint plans and commitments. But on the other hand, Josh awakened feelings in her that she hadn't felt in a long time. With him, she felt alive again, wanted, needed. And the more time they spent together, the harder it was for her to keep that line between friendship and something more. One evening, when Mark was late at work again, Lisa and Josh were sitting in the living room, drinking wine and discussing old times. The wine made her a little more relaxed, and as she noticed, Josh was also a little less restrained. They laughed at some old jokes, remembered how they ran away from lessons together at school, how they competed with each other on the basketball court. At some point, their laughter died down and silence fell between them again. But this time it was filled with something else. Lisa could feel her heart pounding, her breathing getting a little heavier. Josh was sitting next to her, and his hand accidentally touched hers again. But this time, since she didn't take her hand away. The touch was soft, barely noticeable, but it seemed to ignite a spark inside her. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw what she was afraid to see: desire. And at that moment, Lisa realized that she had long since crossed that invisible line beyond which their friendship could no longer remain just friendship. Lisa couldn't remember the first time she felt her attitude towards Josh begin to change. It happened gradually, like a poison that penetrated her thoughts drop by drop until it permeated her entire being. Perhaps it was one of those late evenings when they sat in the kitchen and talked about something simple, but there was always some hidden power in these conversations, something inexpressible that hung in the air between them. Her life with Mark has long ceased to be the bright and intense romance that it seemed at first. Everything became predictable, frozen in a routine, in repetitive actions and feelings that no longer caused the fire that burned in her before. When Lisa looked at Mark, she saw a man with whom she had once been insanely happy. But this man no longer caused her to tremble, did not make her heart skip a beat with joy. Mark became an integral part of her life, but not the part that brought her happiness or inspiration. He was more a habit than a love. Everything changed that night when Josh stayed the night with them again. Mark, as always, was tired and exhausted after a long day at work. His busy schedule, endless calls, meetings and problems at the construction site ate him up completely. He came home late, barely saying goodbye to Lisa, went to the bedroom, where he instantly fell asleep without kissing her goodnight, as it happened once upon a time. Lisa watched his tired silhouette, feeling only emptiness inside. Josh was different. When he was around, Lisa felt alive again. His energy, his smile, the ease with which he treated life, all filled her with something she had long lost. And this night was no exception. After Mark went to bed, Lisa stayed in the kitchen, continuing to drink wine. She couldn't remember how much time had passed. The clock on the wall silently counted down the minutes, but Lisa did not pay attention to them. She felt her consciousness begin to dissipate as her thoughts became vague, and suddenly she realized that she did not want to be alone. Her hands reached for the phone, but she didn't call Mark. Instead, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. It was Josh, who obviously couldn't sleep. He entered the kitchen. His silhouette smoothly crossed the darkness, and Lisa realized that something would change at that moment. She didn't know what it was, but her heart was beating like crazy, as if warning her of an approaching moment that couldn't be ignored. When Josh sat down next to her, Lisa felt the warmth of his body, which spread through the room, filling it more and more and more. His presence was so familiar, but at the same time unexpected. It was Josh, her best friend, her high school prank buddy, the man who always knew her better than anyone else. But he looked different now. She suddenly noticed every detail: how his fingers touch the edge of the table, how his chest rises with each breath, how his eyes flicker slightly in the dim light of the lamp. It all seemed like something new and exciting. The wine made her head spin a little, but not so much that she didn't realize what was going on. Lisa knew they were crossing a line. She felt like this line was thin, like a taut string that was about to break, but there was no fear inside her. On the contrary, her heart was beating in time with their common rhythm, as if there was some inevitable attraction between them that she couldn't resist. The scent of late night hung in the air, the smell of fresh summer air that came through the open window, mixing with the light notes of their wine glasses. Lisa looked up at Josh, and he gave her a look that was more than just friendship. It was the look of a man who had known her since childhood, but now looked at her in a different way. They sat in silence for a long time, as if the world around them had stopped. Lisa stared at her hands, nervously clutching the glass, trying to distract herself from what was happening inside her. But every moment of their silence only reinforced what she felt. Time seemed to slow down, and there was something scary and beautiful at the same time in this silence. As Josh moved forward, Lisa felt her heart tighten. His hand gently slid over her wrist. His touch was so gentle that Lisa could have written it off as an accident, but she knew it was intentional. He didn't take his hand away, and she didn't move away either. Their hands touched like two magnets that can't stay apart, despite all the obstacles. She looked at him again, and suddenly realized that her body had already made this decision a long time ago, even before she realized it with her mind. Lisa couldn't look away anymore. She knew that this moment would change everything. They were on the verge of something inevitable, and she was ready to take a step forward. Her mind was telling her to stop, telling her it was a mistake, that she was betraying Mark. But there was another voice raging inside Lisa, which whispered loudest to her that this was exactly what she wanted, even if it was wrong. That voice was louder than all her doubts and fears. He was the voice of desire, the voice that she had suppressed for so long that she could not resist it now. They both broke the rules that night. That night, they crossed the line that separated friendship from something much more complex and dark. It was a night of temptation, a night when their bodies spoke to each other in a language that was deeper than words. Their touch was gentle and careful, as if they were both afraid to destroy what had been between them before. But at that moment, they couldn't stop. In the bedroom, Mark was asleep, immersed in his usual sleep, and Lisa felt his presence behind the wall, like something distant, alien, like a memory of who she once was. But she was different now. That night, she became someone new, someone who could break the rules in order to feel alive. And that night, she allowed herself to be what she had long dreamed of being: free, sincere, real. After that night, Lisa couldn't look at Josh like she used to. Everything has changed. She knew that she would never be able to return to her old feelings, to her old friendship. What happened between them was more than just a physical connection. It was something deeper, something that would always be between them now. And every time she looked at him, when his gaze met hers again, Lisa knew that they had crossed the line beyond which there was no return. Josh has changed too. His behavior did not betray a single drop of regret, nor a hint of remorse. He was calm, as if everything had happened the way it was supposed to happen. He did not avoid her gaze, did not say unnecessary words. They just went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. But Lisa knew that the same thing was happening inside him. She could feel it in the way he was looking at her now, in the way his touch lingered a little longer on her body. That night was the point of no return for both of them. Now they were connected by something new, something that could no longer be ignored. And although they both tried to keep their distance, Lisa knew it was only a matter of time before they crossed that line again. After all, once they broke it, they could no longer live the way they used to. Night fell over the city like a heavy blanket, absorbing the noises and muffling the sounds of everyday life. Lisa lay in her bed next to Mark, feeling his steady breathing as a constant background, like a mechanism that never loses its rhythm. Darkness enveloped the room, silence pressed on her ears, but Lisa's mind was in chaos. Her thoughts were spinning like crazy, her heart was pounding too fast for such a late hour. The events of the last few weeks did not let her go even at night. She felt like a hunted animal trapped in her own emotions. From the outside, everything looked the same. She was a good wife, lived with her husband, who, although he did not pay as much attention to her as before, was still her mainstay. But there was something broken inside her, something that couldn't be fixed. From the moment that first night had happened between her and Josh, her soul had been torn apart. There was Lisa, who she once was, and there was Lisa, who she became a woman who crossed the line, betrayed her husband with the man she considered her best friend. Every night, when she went to sleep next to Mark, she felt this heaviness. His presence, his breathing, his body next to him, all this no longer brought comfort as before. She could no longer just lie down and fall asleep feeling protected and loved. Now there was constant anxiety, fear, and, strangely enough, excitement in her heart about what had happened to Josh. She found herself closing her eyes and remembering not her husband, but the moments she spent with another man. This memory excited her, ignited in her the passion that she had not felt in marriage for a long time. Tonight was especially hard. Mark fell asleep again as soon as his head touched the pillow, leaving Lisa alone with her thoughts. At first she tried to calm down, tried to focus on breathing, as she had once read in some book about meditation. But it didn't help. Everything was boiling inside her, and the more she tried to banish thoughts of Josh, the more they forced themselves on her. Her memories of how his hands slid over her body, how his lips touched her skin, were too vivid, too real to just forget them. She knew Josh was in the house. He stayed the night with them again today, as he had done many times in recent months. Only now, each of his visits filled the air with something new, an invisible but tangible tension. She could feel his presence in the living room without even seeing him. Her body reacted to it. Her mind couldn't ignore that he was only a few steps away. This knowledge was driving her crazy. Lisa got out of bed, trying not to wake her husband. She moved carefully, trying not to make a single sound, even though Mark was too deeply asleep to hear her. My heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed like it might burst out of my chest. What is she doing? Why is she letting herself do this again? But every step she took, every breath she took, only confirmed that she had already made up her mind. She walked out of the bedroom, feeling the cold air of the hallway on her skin. In the dark, she moved as if by inertia, barely aware of where she was going, but inside she knew she was going to Josh. It was inevitable. After that night, when they first broke the boundaries of friendship, their relationship could no longer remain the same. Lisa felt it with her whole being. She was drawn to him with such force that it was impossible to resist. She went to the door of the living room, where Josh always stayed overnight. She could barely make out his silhouette on the couch in the dark, but her eyes quickly adjusted to the dimness. Lisa stopped for a moment, leaning against the door jamb, as if struggling with herself, with the part that was still trying to keep from going crazy. She knew she had to go back to bed, to her husband, to forget about everything that had happened between her and Josh. But she couldn't. At that moment, her body took over her mind. She took a step forward, then another. The floor creaked under her feet, but Josh didn't move, as if he already knew she was coming. Lisa came closer. Her breathing became shallow and ragged. She knelt down next to the sofa, feeling her heart pounding, every cell in her body tense to the limit. It was the moment when she crossed that invisible line again, beyond which her life would never be the same. That night, their bodies merged into one again, as they had before. Their intimacy was even more intense, as if they both knew it was wrong but couldn't stop. It was a forbidden pleasure that drove them crazy, destroyed everything they knew about themselves and their relationships. Every kiss, every touch was full of passion and guilt, but none of them could stop. That night they found themselves together again in her bedroom, in the bed where she slept with her husband. It was crazy, and Lisa knew it, but she couldn't help herself. When it was over, Lisa lay next to Josh, feeling his breathing gradually slow down. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, her mind was filled with thoughts. What had she done? How can I live with this now? Guilt rolled in waves like a tide, making her feel the full weight of what had happened. She knew it couldn't go on, but she also knew she couldn't stop. Returning to Mark's bedroom, she stared at his face for a long time, illuminated by the soft moonlight filtering through the curtains. He was sleeping, not knowing that just a few minutes ago his wife was with another man in the same apartment. Lisa felt crushed, confused, as if her inner world had been destroyed. Her feelings for Josh were so strong that she couldn't deny them anymore. And although she understood that she had betrayed her husband, deep down she realized that she could no longer ignore what was happening between her and Josh. This night wasn't just another betrayal. It was the moment when Lisa finally realized that her marriage was on the verge of destruction. What started as a temptation, as an occasional weakness, has now become something much more serious. Josh was more than just a friend to her. He became someone she was attracted to on a level she couldn't explain. And every time they got together, that bond only got stronger. After that night, Lisa couldn't look at her life the way she used to. Everything that had once seemed simple and clear to her was now shrouded in darkness, complete obscurity and anxiety. She knew that her choices had led to the fact that there was no turning back. But what to do next? How can she live with the knowledge that her heart no longer belongs to Mark, and her life can no longer be the same as before? There were more questions than answers. Lisa lay in bed, listening to Mark's even breathing, trying to find at least some way out of this crazy maze of her own feelings. But all she knew so far was that her bond with Josh was too strong to just forget about it. And deep down, she knew that even more difficult decisions were ahead of her. Every morning after that night for Lisa began with a heavy realization. She woke up in her bed next to Mark, but now every morning was riddled with feelings of guilt and regret that did not leave her for a minute. Guilt was like a thick cloud that hung over her from the moment she woke up until the night when she went back to the same bed, where her thoughts returned to Josh. And although Lisa tried to convince herself that this was just an isolated incident, just a weakness, she knew it was far from the case. Cheating changed everything. Not only her relationship with Mark, but also her own perception of herself. She could no longer look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. The man she knew had disappeared. There is only a shadow of a woman who was once confident in her marriage, in her feelings and in her life. Now, every move seemed fake, as if she was playing a role that had no meaning for a long time. The relationship with Mark became increasingly strained. Although he didn't know anything about what had happened between her and Josh, Lisa couldn't ignore the fact that their relationship was crumbling. Each of their conversations was dry and superficial. Things that used to seem important, talking about the future, weekend plans, even simple dinners together, now looked like something distant and meaningless. Lisa couldn't look into her husband's eyes without feeling something inside her collapsing. At first she tried to hide her feelings. She was trying to get back into old habits, pretending that everything was fine. Lisa smiled when Mark talked about work, pretended to be interested when he shared plans for the future, tried to act as if nothing had happened. But there was a storm raging inside her that couldn't be hidden. Mark's every touch, his every word, only intensified her inner contradiction. She knew that her connection with Josh was not an accident. It wasn't just a temporary infatuation caused by boredom or disappointment in marriage. It was something deeper, something that Lisa couldn't just ignore. She felt alive with Josh. Their closeness ignited in her those feelings that she had long considered lost. But with that came the realization that they were both involved in something much more complicated. Josh, like Lisa, was now confused. After that night, their relationship became even more strained. They could no longer just chat like they used to, or laugh at old jokes. There was always something unsaid between them. Every time their eyes met, electricity flashed in the air, like a spark that was about to ignite their lives again. But now that spark wasn't just a temptation, it was something dangerous, something that could ruin their lives. Lisa noticed that Josh began to avoid frequent visits. He used to show up at their place almost every week, stayed for dinner, stayed overnight. Now his visits were reduced to rare meetings, and even then he tried not to stay for long. In his eyes, Lisa saw the same doubts that tormented her. Josh, too, was torn between guilt and desire. Their secret was becoming an increasingly heavy burden that both of them could not bear. On one of these days, Lisa found herself alone at home again. Mark, as always, left for work early in the morning, and the apartment was empty. Lisa was sitting in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee, as if hoping to find answers to her questions in it. But there were no answers. Only the agonizing silence that pressed down on her from all sides. Her thoughts kept returning to Josh, like an anchor pulling her to the bottom. She couldn't forget his touch, his warmth, the moment when they stopped being just friends. Lisa tried to distract herself by immersing herself in work or doing household chores, but it didn't help. Every time her thoughts returned to Josh, she felt the same mixture of fear and guilt. Her life split into two parts. One part continued to live with Mark, pretending that everything was the same, and the other part could not let go of those moments with Josh, which became something like a drug for her. She began to lose sleep. The nights became painful, and even when Mark slept next to her, Lisa could not find peace. She was tormented by the thought that she had betrayed the man who had always been there for her. She hated herself for it, but at the same time she couldn't stop thinking about Josh. These two men became two poles for her, between which she was rushing, not knowing which way to go. Even worse, Lisa couldn't find the strength to talk to Mark. She knew she had to confess to him, but the fear of his reaction was too strong. How could she explain to him what had happened? How could you tell a man you've lived with for so many years that you cheated on him with your best friend? These thoughts tore her apart. Lisa was afraid to destroy everything they had built, afraid to see the pain and disappointment in his eyes. Nevertheless, something in her subconsciously sought solutions. Lisa thought more and more often that her marriage had long ceased to bring her happiness. These thoughts grew in her every day until they became almost unbearable. She remembered how she and Mark used to laugh together, how they made plans for the future, how they dreamed of having children and traveling the world. But now it all seemed far away, as if they lived in different worlds. Her feelings for Josh were the opposite of everything she felt for Mark. With Josh, she was different. She could laugh. She felt wanted, needed. But with that came the realization that their relationship was wrong. The guilt of Mark's betrayal became an unbearable burden that weighed on her shoulders every day. Mark may have started to suspect something. He started asking questions that he had never asked before. Lisa caught his gaze on her, sometimes full of bewilderment or weariness. He asked her about Josh, but she always found excuses, always tried to evade the answer, although she understood that this only made the situation worse. Lisa was afraid that Mark would feel that something was wrong between them. He wasn't a fool, and his intuition never failed him, especially when it came to their relationship. Every day turned into a battle with myself. Lisa understood that her life now consists of lies and deception, and the further she went down this path, the harder it was for her to get out. She couldn't pretend anymore that her feelings for Josh were just a random passion. These feelings were real, and they tore her apart from the inside. But at the same time, she couldn't just leave Mark. She knew that this decision would cost her everything. Lisa was trapped in a trap created by her own hands. Every day was a struggle with myself, with guilt, with desire. She tried to convince herself that she could continue to live the way she used to, but deep down she knew it was impossible. At some point, it was all going to collapse. And that moment was getting closer every day. In the end, Lisa was faced with a choice that was going to change her life forever. A choice between two men, a choice between truth and lies, between the past and the future. It was inevitable. The moment that Lisa had been dreading for so long had come. It did not appear immediately. It was not something unexpected, like lightning destroying everything in an instant. Rather, it was a quiet but inescapable event that had been brewing for a long time, like a storm that gradually gathers strength before crashing down on everything around. She understood that it was impossible to delay any further. Her life, which she was trying to keep afloat by balancing between two men, was about to collapse. The only question was when and how it would happen. Lisa could no longer ignore her betrayal. She felt the guilt and tension eating away at her from the inside. Every time she looked into Mark's eyes, her heart ached with pain and fear. She couldn't live this lie anymore, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that her life with Mark was what she wanted. But at the same time, she was afraid to admit the truth. It's scary to destroy what they've built over all these years. They had been through a lot together, and Lisa knew that this conversation would change everything. Mark wasn't blind. In recent weeks, he seemed to feel that something was wrong. Lisa noticed how he began to watch her more, how his gaze lingered on her face when she spoke. He no longer asked those indifferent questions about her day that had become commonplace in their marriage. Instead, she read worry and bewilderment in his eyes. He was trying to figure out what was going on, but he couldn't put all the details together yet. Lisa knew she had to tell him the truth. She couldn't live with this burden anymore, couldn't look into his eyes and pretend that everything was fine. One evening, when Mark returned from work again, Lisa realized that the moment had come. They were sitting at dinner as usual, but there was an unbearable silence between them. Mark didn't speak first, but his silence was more eloquent than any words. Lisa felt her fingers begin to fiddle nervously with the edge of the tablecloth. Everything inside her was shaking. She knew that this conversation would be the end for one of the stages of her life, but she also understood that this end was inevitable. After dinner, Lisa gathered her thoughts. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting for Mark to finish his chores and enter the bedroom. He came in, tired as always, but there was something wary in his movements. He could feel the tension in the air, and Lisa knew she couldn't keep quiet anymore. She had to do this, had to tell him the truth, even if it would tear their lives apart. When Mark sat down next to her, Lisa sighed. Her voice was quiet but firm. She began to speak, not expecting such calmness from herself. She told him everything about Josh, what had happened between them, and how long she had been hiding it. Her voice did not tremble, although everything inside her screamed with pain and shame. Mark listened without interrupting her, and every second his face changed more and more. He was getting paler, his hands were straining, and his eyes were dim, as if the light had gone out in them. Mark didn't say a word. Lisa saw his world crumbling right in front of him as everything they had built collapsed in a few minutes. When she finished, there was silence in the room, so deep that Lisa could hear her own breathing. Mark just sat there, unable to answer right away. She expected anger, a scream, but instead he looked broken, as if his whole world had collapsed. His silence was even worse than any words. Lisa didn't know what to expect next. Her mind was blank. She knew that she had done what she had to do, but it did not bring relief. Mark got out of bed, slowly, as if on autopilot. He didn't look at her, didn't say anything. He just went into another room, leaving her alone in this sea of fear and guilt. Lisa sat on the bed for a long time, unable to move. Her heart was beating so loudly that it seemed it could be heard outside the room. Mark didn't come back to the bedroom that night. He didn't show up the next morning either, when Lisa woke up feeling absolutely drained. The house was dead silent. She walked down the hall and looked into the living room, but Mark wasn't there. His things were still in their places, but he was not there. Lisa felt a strange combination of relief and horror. She knew that his departure was temporary, but she understood that their lives would never be the same again. Josh. Thoughts of him came flooding back, like waves. Lisa couldn't stop thinking about what to do next. Their bond with Josh had become so strong that she couldn't just cut him out of her life. But at the same time, she realized that their relationship was toxic, that they had destroyed everything she had with Mark. Every time she thought about Josh, her heart ached, but at the same time she was drawn to him. It was excruciating her feelings for Josh, was so strong that she couldn't imagine her life without him. Several days passed in a fog. Lisa didn't know what to do. Mark did not show up at home, did not call or write. It was as if he had disappeared, and this only aggravated her inner state. She couldn't start over until she had completed what was going on between her and Mark. Her life hung in suspense. She didn't know where to go, who to turn to. Josh started avoiding her too. He knew that Lisa had told Mark everything, and it had changed his attitude towards her. They could no longer just date like they used to and pretend that nothing was going on. Their relationship was too complicated, too painful. Josh didn't want to be a part of her ruined life. He drifted away, leaving Lisa alone with her pain and confusion. Mark returned a week later. He did not say where he was, did not explain his feelings. He just appeared in the doorway like a ghost. His face was haggard, his eyes empty. Lisa knew that this was the end. He couldn't look at her the way he used to. Their marriage was ruined, and although they could have tried to fix it, Lisa knew that this would not happen. Mark has already made his decision. He didn't scream, he didn't make a scene. He just packed up his things and left, leaving her alone in their apartment, which now seemed empty and cold. Lisa sat on the couch for a long time, listening to the silence in the house. She realized that it was over. Mark was gone, and her life would never be the same again. She had lost not only her husband, but also her best friend. Josh didn't want to be around anymore, and Mark was gone forever. Lisa was left alone, with the mistakes she had made and the feelings that had ruined her life. Now she had to reassemble herself in pieces. She didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if she would ever be able to forgive herself for what she had done. But one thing she knew for sure: her life would never be the same again. Lisa didn't immediately notice how Josh had become an integral part of her life again. It all started gradually, as it usually happens with those changes that turn out to be the most significant. At first, a couple of innocent messages, as if he had returned to their city not to change her fate, but just happened to be nearby. Josh wrote with a familiar ease that she hadn't felt for a long time, either in her relationship with Mark or in her life at all. These messages had nothing to do with the tension she was used to experiencing. They were simple questions about how she was doing, what was new in her life, how her day was going. When he first appeared on the doorstep of their apartment after a long time, Lisa was almost shocked by how easily they began to talk, as if the years that separated them were just an illusion. Josh stood in the doorway with the casual smile she remembered from childhood. Tall, athletic, with dark eyes that sparkled with fun, Josh was always the one who brought lightness and joy to her life. Even now, in this adult world where things had become much more complicated, his presence had the same effect on her. Lisa felt her body relax as she began to smile and laugh, even if she did not understand why. He began to appear more often. At first every few weeks, then every week, and then almost every other day. Mark didn't seem to mind. She and Josh weren't as close as Josh and Lisa, but her husband didn't see anything wrong with that. To him, Josh was just an old friend, a buddy with whom you could chat about football or cars while Lisa cooked dinner. And perhaps that was what made Lisa uneasy. It was all happening too easily, too serenely. She expected some kind of internal resistance, a sense of guilt, or at least a hint that it was all wrong. But on the contrary, every visit from Josh brought her relief. These meetings became a kind of outlet for her. When Mark was busy at work or tired after another day, immersed in business and problems at the construction site, Josh could sit next to her on the couch and discuss everything from old school friends to the simplest everyday issues. Lisa noticed how her mood changed in his presence. She no longer felt trapped in a routine from which there was no escape. Everything seemed easier with Josh. Even the most difficult problems that she discussed with him did not cause her the same emotions that arose in conversations with her husband. They had no complaints, reproaches, or tedious explanations. Lisa felt like herself again, the girl she was before marriage, before all these responsibilities and disappointments. Over time, Josh began to spend more time with them. He started staying overnight when his job required him to be in town for a few days. Mark, who was always busy with his own affairs, took it quite calmly. Perhaps he was even glad that Lisa was not alone in his absence. But Lisa felt more and more that something was accumulating in her heart that she should have suppressed. Something too familiar, but at the same time frightening. On one of those nights when Josh stayed with them again, Lisa woke up in the middle of the night from some strange feeling. Her heart was beating a little faster than usual. She couldn't figure out what exactly caused this concern. Maybe it was the sound from outside, or maybe it was the fact that Josh was sleeping in the next room. But anyway, she couldn't sleep anymore. Lying next to Mark, she felt his presence like a weight. She looked at his profile in the dim light of the bedroom and thought that their life had become so predictable that even this calm breathing next to her no longer brought comfort as before. Mark rolled over in his sleep, making a soft snore that Lisa had long been used to. She sat up in bed with her feet on the floor and reached for a bottle of water on the bedside table. The thirst wasn't that strong, but she wanted to distract herself from the thoughts that were bothering her. After taking a few sips, Lisa got up and headed to the kitchen, deciding that a glass of water would help her calm down a little and fall asleep again. But as she walked through the living room, she noticed a silhouette on the couch. Josh was awake. He was sitting with his back pressed against the pillow, and as it seemed to her, he was thinking about something of his own. Her footsteps seemed to attract his attention, and he turned his head slightly in her direction. Lisa felt her heart begin to beat faster again. She couldn't understand why every time he looked at her, her thoughts became too confused. Maybe it was just fatigue. Perhaps her feelings were caused by the fact that their friendship had revived after a long break. But something told Lisa that it was much more difficult.
Can't you sleep either?
Josh smiled slightly, and that smile made something inside her flutter. He looked calm, but his eyes were twinkling with a strange gleam.
It looks like that. It's strange, I usually sleep like a dead man.
They fell silent. Lisa, standing in the doorway of the living room, felt the air between them become somehow thick, filled with something that she could not name. Josh continued to stare at her, and she suddenly felt her body react to his gaze. It was a barely noticeable tension, as if a spark had passed between them, which she tried her best not to notice. But now it has become impossible. She crossed the room and stood by the window. Looking at the dark silhouettes of houses behind the glass, Lisa tried to collect her thoughts, although she realized that she was doing this only to avoid meeting his gaze. She felt that if she looked at Josh now, everything would change. Their friendship, which they have so carefully maintained all these years, will be in jeopardy. But it was inevitable. Lisa understood that something had changed between them, and this feeling grew with each of his visits. She could no longer ignore the fact that she was attracted to him. And it wasn't just nostalgia for childhood, not just a desire to return to the days when everything was simpler. It was something deeper, something she was afraid to admit.
You know, Liz, I'm glad I came back here. I haven't felt so calm in a long time.
He said it softly, almost in a whisper, but the words stung her. Calmly? Did he feel calm? Lisa, on the contrary, could not find a place for herself. She was trying to figure out how she could stay so calm when a whole hurricane of emotions was raging inside her.
Yes, it's really quiet here. Perhaps too much.
She couldn't stand being around him anymore. The tension had become too much, and she didn't know how to deal with it. Lisa quickly returned to the bedroom, hoping that Mark was still asleep. She lay down next to him, feeling exhausted. Thoughts of Josh were running through her head, of how much everything had changed since his return. And although Lisa tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary embarrassment, she knew the truth. There was no longer just friendship between them. She couldn't ignore her feelings anymore, and no matter how much she wanted to return to the simple life she had, everything had already changed. Lisa spent the next few days in a state of confusion. Josh was coming again, and each visit only exacerbated her inattention. She couldn't act the way she used to with him anymore. Their conversations were full of innuendo, and every time he left, Lisa felt devastated. But at the same time, she was looking forward to his return. It was crazy, but there was nothing she could do about it. Mark, as usual, was immersed in his own affairs and did not seem to notice anything. He was still kind to Lisa, but more and more often she found herself no longer having the same feelings for him that she had before. Every touch of his aroused in her not warmth, but some kind of strange disgust. Lisa tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary crisis, that everything would get better soon. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. Lisa always knew that her connection with Josh was special. Since childhood, they have felt each other like two people who do not need many words between them. They could be silent, but still understand each other. It was this ease of communication that was what she lacked in her relationship with Mark right now. In the early years of marriage, she tried not to think about it, finding solace in the fact that every marriage undergoes changes over time. but everything has changed since Josh returned to their city. At first, she tried to suppress the feeling that was growing inside her, explaining it with nostalgia for the past. But gradually this feeling took over her head. Lisa could no longer ignore the wave of emotions that was growing with every day she spent with Josh. His frequent visits, which at first seemed innocent, became for Lisa not just a source of joy from meeting an old friend, but something more. Every time Josh came, her heart started beating faster. She felt his gaze on her, but did not dare to meet his eyes for too long, fearing that he would read more in her gaze than she would like to show. At first, she attributed it to the usual feminine coquetry, to a slight infatuation which seemed to be harmless. Who hasn't felt sympathy for an old friend? Especially to someone who was always there for her, supported her, knew how to make her laugh and just knew her like no one else. But there was something more inside her that she tried to ignore. Lisa couldn't admit to herself that her feelings for Josh had long gone beyond simple friendship. All this time, Mark continued to remain in the background. He was immersed in his work, which increasingly distanced him from Lisa. The evenings spent together seemed routine to her, and the rare moments of intimacy were empty and mechanical. Mark seemed to have stopped noticing her, immersed in his own affairs. He was not interested in her thoughts, desires, her inner feelings. For him, she was still a wife with whom he could discuss everyday issues, but he stopped seeing her as a woman with whom he could talk about something deep, real. It was different with Josh. With him, she could discuss everything from childhood memories to difficult questions that troubled her soul. And it was this difference that gradually drove Mark out of her thoughts, although Lisa was still trying to cling to the familiar picture of their marriage. But the real shake-up happened one of those days when Mark went on a business trip for a couple of days again. Josh stopped by her place in the evening just to chat, as he had done many times before. Lisa remembered them sitting on the couch, discussing something light and completely insignificant, but her thoughts were far away. She noticed Josh lightly touching her shoulder as he laughed at some joke. This touch was fleeting, but it left behind a strange feeling. Something inside her flared up like a spark, and at that moment Lisa realized that she could no longer deceive herself. Every day it became more difficult for her to suppress these feelings. She began to find herself waiting for his calls and messages, that her day seemed incomplete if she hadn't heard at least a few words from Josh. She stopped enjoying the moments when she was alone with Mark, and even their weekends together began to seem like a painful duty that did not bring any pleasure. She could no longer pretend that their marriage brought her joy. The moment of realization that her feelings for Josh were more than just friendship came unexpectedly, although it was natural. One evening, when Mark was late at work again, Lisa decided to go for a walk in the park. She took her phone with her and at some point, almost without realizing it, dialed Josh's number. She wanted to talk to him, to hear his voice. This time she didn't have any specific topic to talk about. It was just necessary to talk to him. They met at the lake. Josh was in his usual outfit: jeans, sneakers, a light jacket, as if he was ready for another trip to the gym or for a jog. Lisa, on the other hand, felt vulnerable. She had come to this meeting on a spontaneous impulse and now did not know what to say. But Josh, as always, found something to lighten the atmosphere. He made a few jokes, and the tension began to subside. They were walking along the lake, discussing old school days, when suddenly the silence hung between them, from which there was no escape. Lisa stopped. The wind blew her hair slightly, and she stared at the water, trying to find answers to the questions that were swarming in her head. Josh stopped beside her too, and Lisa felt his gaze on her. She knew she had to say something, that this moment couldn't just pass by, but the words stuck in her throat.
Liz, you know you can tell me anything. I'm always here for you.
His voice was quiet, and there was so much warmth and sincerity in it that Lisa caught her breath for a moment. She turned to him, and in his eyes she read what she was afraid of. He knew. He understood what was going on, but he was waiting for her to admit it herself.
Josh,
She couldn't finish the sentence. At that moment, a chasm opened up between them. They were on the verge of something inevitable, and Lisa knew that if she took one more step, everything would change. But this step was almost done. She realized that she had been feeling something more than just friendly sympathy for him for a long time, and Josh knew it. They both knew. A few seconds seemed like an eternity. Josh didn't move, but there was something in his gaze that said more than any words. He was ready for this step, ready for everything to change. But he was waiting for her decision. Lisa suddenly felt the ground become shaky under her feet. She couldn't believe that she had gone so far as to let her feelings get out of control. She wanted to return to a life where everything was simpler, where she could ignore her inner feelings. But now it was impossible. She turned away, looking at the lake, which reflected the sunset sky. Conflicting feelings were fighting inside her. She wanted to hug Josh, tell him everything that had boiled over the months, but at the same time she knew that this moment would destroy everything that she and Mark had built for so many years. She couldn't afford it, couldn't betray the one who had been with her all these years. But thoughts of Mark became more and more blurred, as if his presence in her life was becoming something ghostly. He was her husband, but he had not been the one she loved for a long time. And this realization was another blow for her.
Josh, I can't. I can't go on like this. It's so complicated.
Her voice was low, almost a whisper. She wasn't just talking to Josh, she was talking to herself. Difficult. Yes, everything has become too complicated. Her marriage, her life, her feelings, everything was confused, and she no longer knew how to get out of this maze. Josh took a step closer, and his hand almost touched her shoulder, but he stopped. He was always the one who understood her better than anyone else. He knew that Lisa wasn't ready yet. He knew that she had to make this decision on her own.
I don't want to complicate anything. You know I'll always be there for you, Liz.
These words, spoken with such simplicity and warmth, were both a comfort and a blow. Lisa realized that it had been a long time since she had felt such understanding from the outside. Stamp. He was with her physically, but not emotionally. He didn't notice what was going on inside her, didn't hear her words. But Josh did. They continued to stand side by side, silently, but everything between them became too obvious. Lisa could no longer deny that her feelings for Josh had long crossed the boundaries of friendship. But with that came the realization that her life would never be the same again. She couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening anymore. The day after this meeting, Lisa sat alone for a long time, thinking about what had happened. She couldn't get rid of the image of Josh, of his words, of the way he looked at her. Her feelings for him left her no choice anymore. Now she had to make a decision to continue living in this lie, or to take a step towards those feelings that she had suppressed for so long. Mark, as usual, returned home late. He was tired and, as always, showed no interest in how her day had gone. They sat in the kitchen in silence, and Lisa felt an invisible wall grow between them. Now that she has realized her feelings for Josh, her relationship with Mark has become even more painful. She knew she couldn't go on like this anymore. Her heart no longer belonged to her husband. When Lisa first realized that her feelings for Josh no longer fit into the framework of friendship, she tried to suppress them. At first it seemed possible just not to think about him, not to invite him into the house too often, to focus on Mark and their life together. But the more she tried to control herself, the stronger her desire became. The problem was that every time Josh was around, there was some kind of inexplicable tension between them. This feeling was like a spark that is ready to ignite everything around once it hits a dry tree. Lisa has been trying to convince herself for a long time that all this is just a temporary disturbance caused by a crisis in her marriage. She was trying to establish a relationship with Mark, as if strengthening her attempts to return to the feelings they had before. But each time her efforts were shattered by her husband's indifference, his eternal preoccupation and lack of emotional involvement in their relationship. She told herself that this was how it happened in long marriages, that passion gradually faded away, giving way to habit. But with Josh, it was different. She couldn't explain why his presence aroused such strong emotions in her that she hadn't felt in years. Everything changed that evening when Mark was delayed at work again. Lisa, as usual, spent the day alone, doing household chores and thinking about her feelings. She hadn't planned on inviting Josh to visit, but when he called and offered to come in, she couldn't refuse. Maybe deep down she already knew something was going to happen between them, but she didn't want to admit it to herself. Josh came in, as usual, wearing a light jacket and with that casual smile that always made Lisa feel better. They spent time sitting on the couch discussing some trivia. Josh, as always, joked easily, making her evening more relaxed than it would have been with Mark. But tension was growing inside Lisa. She felt drawn to him, but she couldn't allow herself to give in to that feeling. She was trying to stay calm, trying to act like her usual self. But every smile, every casual gesture intensified her inner turmoil. When the evening came to an end, Lisa felt tired. Not physically, but emotionally, from the constant tension, from the fact that she could no longer cope with her own feelings. She invited Josh to stay the night, as he had done before when Mark was away. It seemed natural and familiar to her, and at the same time there was something forbidden in this sentence. At that moment she couldn't tell if she was doing it out of politeness or out of a desire to spend more time with him. Josh agreed, and they went together to the living room, where he usually slept on the couch. Lisa was going to say good night to him and go to the bedroom, but something made her stay. She couldn't leave. And their conversations, which usually lasted several hours, this time ended in mid-sentence. A silence hung between them, filled with expectation of something more. Lisa stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at him. She could feel her heart pounding faster, her body tensing from the fact that something inevitable was about to happen between them. Josh, sitting on the couch, was silent, but there was something in his gaze that Lisa had been trying to hide from herself all these months. He was also ready for this step. There was a tension in the air that was getting stronger by the second. Lisa could no longer pretend that everything was the same as before. The second she took a step forward, everything inside her turned upside down. It was an instant decision, not thought out and not rational. It was as if something inside her had finally broken down, and she had allowed herself to be led by her desires. There was silence in the room, broken only by their breathing. Lisa walked over to the couch, not fully understanding what she was doing. Everything was happening in a blur, her thoughts were clouded, and only her feelings remained. Josh looked at her without saying a word, but there was so much understanding in his gaze that Lisa felt her resistance completely disappear. She sank down next to him, feeling his warmth seep into her body. It was like a moment that both of them had been waiting for too long, and now they couldn't stop. Everything inside her screamed that this was a mistake, but she couldn't listen to that voice anymore. When their hands touched each other, Lisa felt as if her whole life beyond that moment had ceased to exist. In that second, she forgot about Mark, about her obligations, about what was right and what was wrong. All that mattered was here and now. That night was their first intimacy. Lisa felt her body respond to Josh's every touch, as her thoughts dissolved into this moment. It wasn't just physical intimacy, it was the union of two souls who had kept their distance for too long. Everything that had been between them had accumulated over these months, poured out at this moment. Their touch was gentle, but at the same time full of passion, which they had been trying to suppress for too long. When it was over, Lisa felt strangely empty. She lay next to Josh, listening to his breathing, and realized that now their lives would never be the same. She couldn't go back to what she was before. This moment changed everything that had happened between them, and there was no turning back. The next morning, Lisa woke up with a heavy feeling in her soul. Josh was still there, but now his presence was not as light and carefree as before. There was a silence between them that spoke more than any words. Lisa felt crushed by her own feelings. She was tormented by guilt in front of Mark, but at the same time she knew that she could no longer ignore her feelings for Josh. It wasn't just a physical connection, it was something deeper, something she couldn't explain even to herself. After that night, everything changed. Lisa could no longer look at Josh as just a friend. Every time they were together, she felt the tension between them re-emerge, which they both tried to suppress. Their friendship no longer existed. Instead, there was something new, something dangerous and exciting at the same time. The relationship with Mark has also changed. Lisa began to notice that her behavior with him had changed. She could no longer be the wife she used to be. Her thoughts kept returning to Josh, to the moment they spent together. Lisa tried to behave as usual, but it was impossible. Every time Mark looked at her, she felt guilt rising inside her. She knew she had betrayed him, but she couldn't do anything about it. A few days passed, and Josh came back to their house. Lisa knew that their relationship would not be the same now. She felt that their bond had become too strong to just ignore it. With each new meeting, there were fewer words between them, and more tacit understanding of what had happened. They both knew they had crossed the line, but neither of them was ready to stop. Lisa felt crushed. She couldn't find the strength to admit to Mark what had happened. Every night when she went to bed next to him, she felt the wall growing between them, which was getting higher every day. Their rare moments of intimacy now seemed empty and meaningless to her. Lisa could no longer feel what she had felt before. Her body and mind now belonged to another person, and it was both a frightening and liberating feeling for her. Her life began to split into two parts. On the one hand, there was Mark, her husband, with whom she had shared many years, and with whom she had common plans for the future. On the other hand, there was Josh, who awakened feelings in her that she had long forgotten about. Lisa didn't know how to deal with this contradiction, but one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. And every day became a struggle with herself for her. Lisa tried to convince herself that all this would end soon, that she would be able to forget about what had happened and return to her old life. But every day the thought seemed more and more impossible to her. Since Lisa and Josh crossed that invisible line, their lives began to be filled with complex and contradictory emotions that haunted them day and night. Lisa was in a state of constant internal tension, which was growing every day. She felt the reality around her gradually distort. What seemed stable, solid and right began to crumble. And each new day only intensified this feeling. Mark, as always, was busy with work and the problems that surrounded him, and Lisa couldn't stop thinking about Josh. But what worried her even more was that she felt that with each visit he was becoming an increasingly important part of her life. This internal struggle was exhausting her. On the one hand, she tried to convince herself that everything that happened with Josh was a mistake, a weakness caused by temporary difficulties in marriage. But on the other hand, her heart was telling a different story. When Josh was around, her body reacted in a way she hadn't felt for a long time. It awakened life, passion, desire, which had long since died out in her relationship with Mark. These feelings overwhelmed her, but Lisa tried to suppress them, although it became more difficult every day. The feeling that she was changing the brand not only with her body, but also with her soul, tore her apart. She constantly tried to convince herself that this was just a passing infatuation, that everything would get better soon, and she would be able to focus on her marriage again. But as soon as she thought about it, her thoughts went back to Josh, and she realized that nothing would end so easily. Their relationship with Josh became increasingly strained. There was no longer the lightness that existed before, when they could talk for hours about everything in the world without feeling the slightest tension. Now their every interaction was filled with a hidden tension that prevented them from breathing freely. Lisa noticed how Josh began to avoid their meetings, as if he was afraid of what was going on between them. He no longer stayed with them at night as often as before, and if he did, he was reserved and closed all the time. Lisa felt this alienation and could not understand whether it pleased her or, on the contrary, tormented her. On the one hand, she was glad that Josh was trying to keep his distance, because it meant that he realized how dangerous their attraction to each other had become. But on the other hand, it only intensified her inner struggle. She felt like she was losing control of the situation, and it scared her. The time Josh was with her became a source of painful desire and guilt at the same time. The nights were the hardest time for her. Mark, as always, fell asleep instantly, his deep, measured breathing filling the room. But Lisa couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the rhythm of his sleep, and each time it reminded her how far they had become from each other. She no longer felt the connection that once existed between them. Their marriage seemed to her an empty, formal union, devoid of passion and mutual understanding. Every time she looked at Mark, she felt a sense of alienation. She saw before her the man who had once been everything to her, but now they seemed to live in different worlds. One night Lisa couldn't sleep again. She was lying in bed, listening to the soft sounds outside the window, when suddenly she felt that she could no longer be in this state in this room, next to Mark, in this marriage that had become a cage for her. In the darkness of the room, her mental anguish became unbearable. She wanted to scream, to tear apart this invisible net that bound her movements, her thoughts, her feelings. She couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. Quietly, trying not to wake Mark, Lisa got out of bed and went out into the hallway. She didn't know what she was going to do. She just wanted to get away from this suffocating feeling. Her footsteps seemed to be too loud in the silence of the house, but Mark did not wake up. Lisa headed into the kitchen, trying to put her thoughts in order, but her anxiety only increased. When she reached the living room where Josh usually slept, her heart stopped for a moment. She knew that he was staying with them that evening, and she knew that she should just go back to the bedroom, to her husband, and go back to bed, pretending that everything was as usual. Instead, she stood on the threshold of the living room, leaning against the door frame. In the darkness of the room, she could barely make out the outline of Josh's figure on the couch. He seemed to be asleep, but Lisa couldn't take her eyes off him. The silence was deafening, as if all the sounds of this world had disappeared. Lisa stood motionless, feeling a sense of disaster growing inside her. She knew that if she took another step, if she got close to him, she wouldn't be able to go back anymore. But at that moment she was mesmerized. She was drawn to him like a magnet, and she could no longer resist this attraction. The inner voice that was trying to keep her from doing anything else died down. Lisa felt her body stop obeying her mind. At that moment, everything she thought was right no longer mattered. All moral principles, all obligations, everything that connected her with her previous life, collapsed. She moved closer to the couch, feeling her breathing become ragged. Her hands were shaking, but she couldn't stop. Lisa slowly knelt down next to the couch, not taking her eyes off Josh. He didn't move, his breathing was even, but she knew he wasn't asleep. There was a heavy silence between them, which was saturated with everything that they were both afraid to say out loud. It was a silence filled with guilt, fear, but also a desire that they could no longer suppress. Lisa sat next to him for a long time, unable to move. Her heart was pounding. It seemed like it was about to jump out of her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: this was the moment when her life would change forever. And this moment was inevitable. When Josh finally opened his eyes, their gazes met, and Lisa realized that their silence said more than any words. Everything that was hidden between them became apparent in an instant. Her body was shaking with tension from what was about to happen. At that moment, she knew that she had crossed the line beyond which there was no way back. This night became a point of no return for them. Their bodies merged together, violating all the rules and obligations that existed before. It wasn't just a physical connection, it was confirmation that their attraction to each other had become too strong to ignore. Lisa allowed herself to be vulnerable, allowed herself to experience feelings that she had suppressed for too long. She couldn't pretend that everything was under control anymore. Now they both knew the truth. There was no friendship between them anymore, only passion mixed with guilt and forbidden desire. After that night, Lisa returned to her bedroom, to Mark. She stared at his sleeping face for a long time, illuminated by the faint light coming through the window. She felt crushed. Her heart was filled with guilt and fear of what would happen next. She knew that she had betrayed him, that she had destroyed everything they had built together, but at the same time she felt strangely relieved. Now she didn't have to pretend anymore. Everything was in its place. She knew who she really wanted all these months. In the days that followed, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that her relationship with Josh was now doomed to repeat itself. Every time she saw him, there was a silence between them, full of tension. They both tried to behave as usual, but it was impossible. Their intimacy had become something much more serious than they could have imagined. Now their relationship was something irreversible, and every day Lisa felt her life becoming more complicated and complicated. This night was not just a mistake or a fleeting weakness. It was the moment when Lisa finally realized that her life would never be the same again. She had feelings with Josh that she hadn't had with Mark in a long time. It was something that destroyed her from the inside, but at the same time made her truly alive. Now Lisa was faced with a choice that scared her to the point of trembling. She didn't know how to live with this knowledge anymore. Her marriage was on the verge of collapse, but she couldn't bring herself to just break up with Mark. Josh became a source of desire and passion for her that she couldn't ignore, but at the same time he became her biggest temptation. After that night, when Lisa first crossed the line between friendship and something deeper with Josh, her life began to fall apart. Outwardly, everything was still the same. Lisa continued to perform her usual duties. Mark came home after work, and Josh occasionally dropped by to visit them. But a chasm opened up inside her, which grew deeper every day and seemed to be filled with guilt and despair more and more. That night was a point of no return for Lisa. She changed everything, even if Mark didn't know it yet. Every morning Lisa woke up with a heavy heart. Mark was still sleeping next to him. His breathing remained even and calm. Nothing seemed to have changed. But Lisa felt like a stranger in her own life, as if she was in constant tension, as if her consciousness was stuck in another reality where she no longer belonged to herself or Mark. She had betrayed her husband, betrayed their past together, and this knowledge tormented her every minute as soon as she opened her eyes. Everything she did seemed artificial to her now. The old ease she had felt with Josh was no longer comforting. There was a hidden awareness in every movement that she had ruined her life. But what tormented her most was not only her guilt about Mark, but also the fact that her feelings for Josh continued to grow. Every time Lisa saw Mark, her heart ached with pain and regret. She knew she had betrayed his trust, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. It seemed as if an invisible wall had grown up between them, which was getting higher every day. Mark didn't seem to notice what was going on inside her. He still came home tired, lost in his thoughts, and Lisa tried not to show him her inner struggle. They still talked about everyday things, about work, about weekend plans, about household issues, but Lisa could no longer perceive these conversations as something meaningful. Every word she uttered seemed fake to her, as if she was playing a role in a play that had long since lost its meaning. She tried to bring herself back to her usual life, hoping that this feeling of betrayal and guilt would eventually go away. Lisa was doing household chores, spending time with Mark, but every time her thoughts returned to Josh, she felt a wave of fear and desire rise inside her at the same time. These feelings were so strong that she couldn't handle them anymore. There was something unsaid in every look Josh gave her, something that said more than any words, and although they both tried to behave with restraint, Lisa knew that there would no longer be the same friendship between them. She noticed that Josh was starting to come to visit less often. It was strange, but Lisa understood that he also felt the tension that was now hovering between them. Their meetings became less frequent, and every time he appeared, Lisa felt not only joy at seeing him, but also fear that something might happen again that both of them could not control. Her feelings for him did not weaken, but on the contrary, became more and more intense. She felt herself being pulled towards him with such force that she couldn't ignore it anymore. But with each of his visits, her inner guilt only intensified. And every day their communication became more strained. Lisa couldn't look at Josh as just a friend anymore. She knew that their relationship had gone too far, and it depressed her. But despite this, she could not refuse to meet with him. She was drawn to him like a magnet, and every time they were close, there was that tension between them that she could no longer control. They tried to keep their distance, but it became impossible. Lisa felt that her life was splitting into two halves. One part of her soul belonged to Josh, and the other to Mark. But every day this separation became more painful. Lisa began to lose sleep. The nights had become unbearable for her. Every time she went to bed next to Mark, she felt her inner pain only getting worse. She could no longer feel at ease in his presence. Mark still didn't seem to notice what was going on inside her. He was so immersed in his work and worries that he did not notice how their marriage was slowly crumbling. Lisa couldn't look him in the eye. Her soul was torn with guilt. She felt like a traitor, but at the same time she couldn't stop thinking about Josh. One evening, when Mark returned from work late again, Lisa was sitting in the kitchen, lost in her thoughts. She hadn't heard Mark enter the house, and it wasn't until he called out to her that she flinched. Looking at him, she suddenly felt that her heart was no longer beating with the same warmth as before. It was a feeling of emptiness that she couldn't ignore. Lisa understood that her love for Mark had faded, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him about it. Everything they had built together now seemed far away and unimportant to her. She no longer felt the connection that had existed between them in the early years of their marriage. Ever since her relationship with Josh began, Lisa has felt like she was in limbo. Her life became a series of constant doubts and torments. She couldn't figure out what to do next. On the one hand, she didn't want to lose Mark, with whom she had so much in common. They made plans together, went through many difficulties together, and Lisa couldn't just erase those years. But on the other hand, her feelings for Josh had become too strong to ignore. Lisa tried to avoid meeting Josh, but every time she saw him, her heart skipped a beat. Their eyes met, and Lisa felt the same feeling that she had been trying to suppress for so long flare up between them again. She knew that their relationship had gone beyond friendship, and now they were both trapped by their own desires. But the further they went, the more Lisa realized that all this could not go on forever. Mark may have started to suspect something. He became more attentive to her, asking more questions about how she spent the day, what she did, who she saw. Lisa sensed his wariness, but every time she tried to evade the answer. She was tormented by the thought that he might guess. She knew that sooner or later Mark would realize that something had changed between them, but every day she postponed this moment, afraid to ruin everything completely. She couldn't hide her feelings anymore. Lisa understood that her relationship with Mark was becoming more and more strained, and this only increased her inner tension. Every conversation they had, every minute they spent together, seemed empty and meaningless to her. They couldn't talk about their feelings anymore, and every time Mark tried to get close to her, Lisa pulled away. She couldn't bear to pretend that everything was the same, but she didn't know how to admit to him that she had cheated, and she wasn't sure she could handle his reaction. With each passing day, her inner conflict only intensified. Lisa couldn't keep living this lie, but at the same time she was afraid of destroying everything she had with Mark. She knew that she had made a choice in favor of Josh, but she still could not completely break with her previous life. This feeling was tearing at her, making her suffer day after day. On one of these days, Lisa woke up with a feeling that she could no longer continue this game. She knew she had to make a decision, otherwise her life would turn into an endless chain of suffering. Her love for Mark has faded, but she couldn't just give up on their past together. But even more painful was the realization that her attraction to Josh had become so strong that she could no longer live without him. Lisa realized that a serious choice was waiting for her ahead, which would determine her future life. Her inner world turned out to be split between two men, and every day became more and more painful. She couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. Her marriage to Mark was falling apart before her eyes, and although he did not yet know the whole truth, Lisa understood that this moment was inevitable. Now she had to make the most difficult decision of her life, to choose between the past and the future, between duty and passion. And although Lisa did not know how to deal with this choice, she understood that she could no longer stay in this trap. Her life was on the verge of disaster, and every new day brought her closer to the moment when everything she had been hiding for so long was about to surface. The moment that Lisa had been dreading for so long has finally arrived. She could no longer avoid the truth, hide behind the daily routine, and try to live as if nothing had happened. Her life turned into a real nightmare filled with guilt, fear, and endless doubts. With each passing day, the tension grew like a thickening cloud over her head, ready to burst into a storm at any moment. And she knew it would all be over soon, but the only question was when it would happen, and how. Lisa could no longer find solace in anything. Every day was a painful ordeal. At first she thought she could handle it, go back to her old life, save her marriage, forget about what happened between her and Josh. She was trying to focus on her relationship with Mark again, trying to bring back the feelings that had once been between them. But it turned out to be impossible. Mark had become a stranger to her. His touch only irritated her, and his conversations were like empty chatter, devoid of meaning. There had been a war going on inside her for a long time, but every day she became more helpless in front of her own feelings. Josh has long been more than just a friend. Their relationship went beyond friendship the night they crossed the line for the first time. And although Lisa tried to convince herself that it was a mistake, a weakness, she increasingly realized that her attraction to Josh was not just a temporary infatuation. These were real feelings that she couldn't ignore anymore. After that night, their relationship changed. Josh tried to keep his distance, but every time they were close, there was an irresistible attraction between them that could no longer be hidden. Their looks, gestures, even casual touches, everything reminded them that they had violated the rule, and this could not but leave a mark on their lives. Lisa felt more and more that her inner world was splitting into two parts. On the one hand, she continued to be Mark's wife, to live with him, to share her life with him, but her thoughts and feelings were completely connected with Josh. She couldn't stop herself. Each new meeting with Josh only deepened her inner rift. She could not refuse these meetings, although she understood that they only deepened the gap between her and Mark. Lisa began to avoid talking to her husband, not wanting to face his questions, his perplexity. Mark, in turn, also began to notice the changes. He was no longer that indifferent person who was absorbed in work and career concerns. He felt that Lisa was moving away from him, but he did not know what the reason was. Mark did not immediately begin to suspect that something was wrong. At first he thought that this was an ordinary crisis in a relationship that could be overcome. He tried to establish communication with Lisa, asked questions about her days, and was interested in her mood. But Lisa avoided these conversations every time. Her heart had not belonged to him for a long time, and she could not bear to pretend that everything was the same. It became unbearable for her every time she looked at Mark. She saw not the man she had once loved, but the man she had betrayed. And this feeling tormented her. One morning, when Mark got ready for work, Lisa realized that she couldn't pull any more. She was sitting in the kitchen, looking out the window at the empty street, and felt something break inside her. It was the moment when she realized that everything she had been trying to hide for so long had to come out. She was no longer satisfied with this double life, this constant feeling of guilt that was eating away at her from the inside. Lisa realized that she couldn't pretend anymore. At that moment, she made the decision to tell Mark the truth. The whole day passed in agonizing anticipation. Lisa did not know exactly how she would tell her husband about her infidelity. She imagined his reaction: anger, disappointment, tears. She knew it would destroy him. And the thought was killing her from the inside out, but she also understood that there was no other life anymore. From the moment she found herself in bed with Josh, her life changed forever. It was impossible to return to the old relationship with Mark. She couldn't love him the way she used to. When Mark returned home, Lisa could no longer hide her nervousness. She was sitting on the couch, clutching a mug of cold tea in her hands, and watched him enter the house. Everything seemed familiar that evening. He took off his coat, put his briefcase by the door, and approached her with a smile on his face. But Lisa knew that this habit was about to collapse. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was afraid Mark would hear it. She couldn't put this conversation off any longer. After dinner, when Mark sat next to her on the couch, Lisa felt a wave of fear wash over her. She didn't know where to start, didn't know how to find the words that wouldn't destroy everything at once. But she had no other choice. She knew this conversation had to happen, that she couldn't lie to Mark anymore. It was necessary, no matter how painful it was. When Lisa started to speak, her voice was trembling. Every word was hard to come by. She tried to explain what had happened, how her feelings for Mark had changed, how she began to feel lonely in their marriage. She did not blame him, but she could not say that she was not to blame herself. There were no excuses in her story, only the truth, which was destroying their marriage more and more by the second. She talked about everything, about her feelings for Josh, about what happened between them. Mark listened to her in silence. His face gradually turned pale, and his eyes went out. He didn't interrupt her, didn't ask any questions. Lisa couldn't understand what was going on inside him, but she could see that he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. When she finished speaking, there was silence in the room. Lisa waited for his reaction, shouting, reproaches, tears. But none of this followed. Mark just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if his world had collapsed in an instant. After a long silence, he got up from the sofa and went into the bedroom. Lisa did not follow him. She knew that this moment was the end of their marriage. They couldn't be together anymore. She knew that she had destroyed everything they had built together for so many years. Her heart was bursting with pain, but at the same time she felt strangely relieved. Now everything was open, and she no longer had to pretend. The next morning, Mark packed his things. He didn't say a word. His face was impassive, but Lisa could see in his eyes the hurricane of emotions that was raging inside him. He didn't ask questions, didn't ask for explanations. He just left, closing the door behind him, leaving Lisa alone in their empty house. She knew this moment would come, but she didn't think it would be so painful. After Mark left, Lisa sat in silence for a long time. The house they had built together now seemed empty and gloomy to her. She felt like her inner world had fallen apart, and now she had to put it back together piece by piece. Her marriage to Mark ended, and with it ended most of the life she had known. Lisa realized that now she had to start all over again, but did not know how to do it. Josh, after learning about what Lisa had told Mark, also began to distance himself. Their relationship, which began as something romantic and passionate, has now become a source of pain and suffering. Josh didn't want to be the reason for the destruction of her marriage, and that realization weighed on him. He began to appear less frequently in her life, and soon Lisa realized that she had lost not only her husband, but also Josh. Now she was alone. Lisa couldn't believe for a long time that it was over. Her life had turned into a void, and she didn't know how to fill that void. She had lost two men who were important to her, and now loneliness awaited her. But at the same time, she understood that it was her choice, her decision, and now she had to accept the consequences. Lisa realized that her life would never be the same. Now she was on the threshold of a new stage, but she did not know what it would be like. She had to go through pain and suffering to find herself again. But she was ready for this. Now that it was over, she could start building her life anew without lying and self-deception. From the moment Josh became an integral part of Lisa's life again, everything gradually began to change. At first, she tried to hold on to her familiar world: home, work, husband. It seemed that it was possible to cope with the surging feelings and suppress the growing attraction to Josh. In those moments when Josh was around, her life would come alive for a moment and then sink back into a grey routine. Lisa understood that her marriage to Mark had long since lost the energy that had once united them. But it wasn't until Josh returned that she began to realize the depth of the problem. Externally, nothing has changed. Mark still came home late, often tired and exhausted from work. He continued to live his usual life, but Lisa noticed that something was starting to leave their relationship. Perhaps it was because her feelings for him were no longer as strong as they used to be. Perhaps it was a natural process that happens with every marriage. But anyway, now their every evening was filled with a vague but tangible tension. Lisa felt more and more like a stranger in her own home. Previously, when Mark returned from work, she tried to create comfort, take care of him, cook dinner. She felt her role in this house, as the keeper of their family hearth. But now everything has changed. Her movements became mechanical, as if she was performing her duties by inertia without putting any soul into them. The dinner she cooked every night now seemed tasteless to her, as did their conversations. Mark was immersed in his own affairs. He didn't talk much. But Lisa began to notice that he no longer showed the same interest in their common affairs. In the evenings, he increasingly went to his workshop or sat at the computer for a long time, pretending to work. Sometimes she could hear him talking on the phone with one of his colleagues, but these conversations seemed to her like background noise. Their communication was reduced to short phrases, routine questions and answers, as if they were two strangers who happened to be in the same house. One day, when Mark returned home, Lisa already knew that this evening would be the same as everyone else. She cooked dinner as usual, set the table, waiting for his arrival. But Mark was in no hurry to sit down at the table. He walked past her, glancing briefly at the food, as if he hadn't even noticed her efforts. Lisa felt a chill inside, as if something invisible had entered their house, causing them to distance themselves from each other even more. Mark quickly changed his clothes and went to his workshop, leaving Lisa alone. She sat at the table, staring at the plate of food, and felt her thoughts return to Josh. Every time she was alone, her mind began to fill with thoughts of him. It was stronger than her, as if something inside was tearing apart, demanding attention to these feelings. Lisa understood that her marriage with Mark was slowly falling apart, but she didn't know what to do about it. A few days passed, and things got even worse. Lisa noticed that Mark was getting late at work more and more often. If earlier he had at least sent messages warning that he would be late, now he did not even do that. Lisa tried to ignore it, telling herself that this was just a stressful period in his career, but inside she felt anxious. Something had changed in their relationship, and that something was subtle but tangible. One evening, Mark returned home later than usual. Lisa was not waiting for him, sitting down with a book in the living room. She decided that she would no longer try to hold his attention or try to return their previous relationship. It all seemed pointless to her. There was an awkward silence between them when he entered the house. Mark didn't say a word, just walked past her, giving her a look that had neither warmth nor concern. Lisa continued to read, pretending that she was not offended by his indifference, but everything was bubbling inside her. She understood that she could no longer live in such a state. Their life together became an empty formality, where each lived his own life without noticing the other. She tried to remember the last time Mark had looked at her with love or interest, but only fragments of their days together, full of household worries, came to mind. Over time, Mark began to leave for work earlier and return even later. Lisa was often left alone for the whole day, filling her time with random activities. The house that had once been filled with warmth now seemed cold and empty to her. She spent her days in silence, trying not to think about her problems, but thoughts of Josh did not leave her. It was hard for her to admit that her feelings for Josh were getting stronger, while her marriage to Mark was falling apart before her eyes. Mark stopped asking questions. If earlier he was interested in her affairs, asked how her day had gone, now his questions were reduced to those on duty. Is everything okay? Lisa answered in short sentences, not wanting to go into details. Her life became something that happened by itself, as if she was no longer a participant in it, but only an observer. Sometimes it seemed to her that Mark purposely avoided talking, as if he was afraid to find out the truth that lay behind their silence. One day Lisa noticed that Mark was spending less time at home, even on weekends. He always found something to do, then he'll go to his friends, then he'll take care of the car in the garage. Lisa understood that this was a form of escape from the reality in which they were both stuck. But she was afraid to admit that she was running too only from her own feelings. Mark may have started to suspect that something was wrong between them, but he didn't ask questions or make a scene. This estrangement became more and more palpable every day. In the evenings, Mark didn't touch her anymore. Their intimacy, which used to be a part of their lives, has become rare and formal. Even in those moments when they went to bed, Lisa felt that a wall had been built between them. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. His gaze was distracted, full of fatigue and indifference. Lisa knew that this was not just a crisis in the relationship, it was the end of their marriage. One morning, when Lisa was cooking breakfast, Mark came into the kitchen with a blank look. He sat down at the table, his face buried in the phone, and did not even look at her. It was already a familiar thing they spent the morning hours in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts. But on this day something changed. Lisa suddenly felt that she could no longer tolerate this silence.
Mark, we need to talk.
Mark looked up from the phone, frowning slightly, as if he hadn't expected to hear her voice.
About what?
She hesitated for a moment, not knowing where to start. It seemed to her that this conversation should have happened a long time ago, but she kept putting it off, hoping that everything would work out by itself. Now it was obvious that they could no longer continue to live the way they had before.
About us. About what's happening to us.
He sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His gaze was tired and indifferent.
What's going on? We just live like we always do.
Lisa felt a wave of despair rising inside her. Her heart ached at the thought that Mark couldn't see what was going on between them. How could anyone not notice that their relationship was crumbling?
No, Mark. We don't live, we exist. You feel it yourself.
He stared at her in silence, and for a moment there was something like regret in his eyes. But this feeling quickly disappeared, giving way to a cold calmness. Mark didn't want to talk. It was easier for him to avoid conflict than to solve problems. It was part of his nature to walk away from unpleasant conversations, pretending that everything was fine.
I'm tired, Lisa. Maybe it's not about us, but just about work, about life.
Those words were the last straw for her. She couldn't take this indifference anymore. Their relationship has long been an empty shell, devoid of real intimacy. But despite all this, she felt like she was still trying to fix something, even if she didn't know exactly how. Mark got up from the table and headed for the door, leaving her alone. Lisa stared after him for a long time, not knowing what to do now. It took Lisa a moment to realize that their wedding anniversary was just around the corner. In recent months, the days had become a monotonous routine, and she had stopped following the calendar. Her life turned into a series of grey days that were no different from each other. Every day brought the same anxiety, mixed with guilt that her thoughts were filled not with Mark, but with Josh. But when she accidentally saw the date of their wedding on the calendar, something clicked inside her. She realized with horror that perhaps they had both forgotten about that day. The wedding anniversary has always been a special day for Lisa and Mark. In previous years, they would arrange a small party, exchange gifts, plan a weekend together, or have dinner at the restaurant they loved so much. It was their ritual, a symbol of their union, a reminder that despite all the difficulties of life, they were together, and their marriage was still based on some deep feelings. But now that Lisa realized that their anniversary was close, she felt a strange emptiness. This realization came when she stood at the window, looking out at the city, which had long been for her just the background of her complicated life. She looked up at the grey sky and reflected on how much everything had changed. Their marriage, which had once been strong, was gradually turning into an empty shell. Lisa no longer felt the closeness she once shared with Mark. And the thought that the anniversary was just another day for them only increased her pain. A few more days passed, but Mark still did not remember the approaching date. Lisa watched him with a kind of morbid curiosity, checking every day to see if his behavior would change, if he would have at least a hint of preparation for this event. But nothing changed. Mark continued to come home late, sometimes without even having time to have dinner, all the time referring to work, which seemed to have become for him not only an occupation, but also a refuge from reality. On the eve of the anniversary, Lisa was sitting in the kitchen, twirling her phone in her hands. She thought about reminding Mark of the day ahead, but something inside her resisted. An inner voice was saying that she shouldn't do anything. If he doesn't remember himself, it will only confirm how far they are from each other. Lisa decided that she would not take any action, but would just wait and see what would happen. It was their anniversary day. Lisa woke up early. There was an unpleasant feeling of heaviness in her chest, as if she had a premonition of something inevitable. She got up quietly so as not to wake Mark and went to the bathroom. In the mirror, her reflection seemed strange to her dull eyes, a tired face that had not had a joyful smile for a long time. She looked at herself for a long time, thinking about how much had changed in the last few years. Her marriage was slowly crumbling, and she herself was lost in the vortex of her own feelings and could not find a way out of this maze. Mark woke up later. He went out into the kitchen, giving Lisa a cursory glance. At that moment, she realized that he didn't remember the anniversary. He looked as usual, with the usual morning fatigue on his face, as if yesterday was an ordinary working day, and not the eve of their family holiday. Lisa looked at him, waiting for at least the slightest sign that he remembered something, but nothing happened. He quickly drank coffee, dropped a few phrases on duty that he was going to have a difficult day at work, and left, leaving Lisa alone. When the door closed behind him, Lisa remained sitting at the table, feeling a dull pain growing inside her. She expected disappointment, but she still wasn't ready for it. Their wedding anniversary, which used to be a symbol of their love, now became for her only a painful reminder of how far they had come from each other. She tried to convince herself that it was just a date, that it wasn't the numbers that mattered, but their feelings, but how could she deny the obvious? Mark forgot, and at the same time she realized that their marriage was finally bursting at the seams. Lisa spent the day all alone. She didn't know what to do, where to put herself. Thoughts of Josh overwhelmed her again. He had been her only comfort lately, the only person she felt alive around. But at the same time, the realization that her feelings for Josh had caused her to break up with Mark only increased her pain. She couldn't go to any of them, but she couldn't stay put either. Her life hung in some kind of strange limbo, where the past pulled her back, and the future seemed frightening and unclear. In the evening, Mark returned home later than usual. He looked tired and annoyed, as if the day hadn't gone the way he had planned. Lisa watched him, trying not to show that she expected something special from him. He walked into the living room, dropping his bag on the floor, and immediately turned on the TV. It was an ordinary evening in their house, silent, steeped in indifference and emptiness. Lisa no longer knew how to communicate with Mark. Their conversations were reduced to routine phrases, and any discussion of something serious seemed unnecessary and meaningless. Finally, Lisa couldn't stand it. She wasn't going to remind him about the anniversary, but the internal tension became unbearable.
Mark, do you know what day it is today?
Mark looked away from the TV for a moment, but his face remained unreadable.
No, why?
Those words hit her harder than she expected. She felt her insides tighten, but tried to hide her reaction. Mark didn't even try to remember. It didn't matter to him. And at that moment, Lisa realized that their marriage no longer existed. He was just a formality, a habit that neither of them could get rid of.
Today is our anniversary.
Mark froze for a moment, then his face became serious, but not upset, as if this news did not bring him any discomfort. He looked at Lisa, and there was not a shadow of regret or guilt in his eyes. He just didn't know what to say.
I'm sorry. I completely forgot. There was a lot of work.
He turned back to the TV as if the conversation was over. Lisa remained standing in the doorway of the living room, feeling anger and despair building inside her. Mark didn't even try to fix the situation, didn't offer anything that could soften this blow. Her heart was bursting with the realization that she was no longer important to him, that their relationship had long since lost its significance. The rest of the evening passed in deathly silence. Lisa was sitting in the bedroom, feeling a hurricane of emotions raging in her chest. She thought about Josh, how attentive he had been to her in recent months, how his support had helped her cope with loneliness and disappointment. At that moment, she realized that she could no longer stay in this marriage. Her feelings for Mark faded, and his indifference was the final blow to their relationship. Lisa knew that she would not be able to return to her old life, and this day finally confirmed her in this decision. A few days have passed. Lisa tried not to think about what had happened, but every time Mark returned home, she was overcome by a feeling of bitterness. He was no longer the person she wanted to be with. They lived under the same roof, but they were as far apart as ever. Lisa realized that Josh was now her only source of joy, but at the same time she realized that her relationship with him was impossible until she put all the dots over the I in her marriage. One evening, when Mark returned home late again and, as usual, went to the TV, Lisa made a decision. She couldn't put the conversation off any longer. They needed to talk about what was going on, that their marriage no longer existed, that they had become strangers to each other. Lisa felt that now, after everything that had happened, she had to go to the end, otherwise her life would turn into an endless chain of days full of pain and loneliness. When they sat down to dinner, Lisa decided to start a conversation.
Mark, we need to talk. I can't live like this anymore.
Mark looked at her in surprise, but there was no fear or excitement in his eyes. He seemed to have been expecting this conversation for a long time, but he didn't know how to start.
What do you want to say?
Lisa took a deep breath. It was hard for her to speak, but she knew it was necessary. She looked at Mark and realized that this man no longer made her feel the way she had before. Everything they had was gone, and she couldn't get it back.
I can't pretend anymore. You and I live like two strangers. You feel it yourself.
Mark nodded, but his face remained unreadable. He was silent, waiting for her to continue.
Our marriage hasn't been the same for a long time. I don't feel the connection I used to feel anymore. You can see for yourself that we have become estranged from each other. And I think it can't go on like this.
Mark didn't answer right away. He put down his fork and leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtfully at Lisa.
I know. But what do you suggest?
These words were spoken with cold determination. Lisa realized that this conversation was inevitable, and now they both have to make a decision about what will happen next. That evening, Lisa realized that her marriage with Mark had finally come to an end. After that forgotten anniversary, when Lisa finally realized that her marriage with Mark had been destroyed to the ground, her thoughts began to return to Josh more and more often. He became for her the very person who reawakened long-dead feelings in her, made her feel alive again. With each visit, with each meeting, she felt more and more attracted to him. However, these feelings did not bring her relief or peace of mind. On the contrary, they only aggravated her internal conflict. Lisa understood that her relationship with Josh had long gone beyond friendship. Once innocent meetings, conversations and laughter have now become saturated with hidden tension. Every time they were near, her heart began to beat faster, and her body began to react to his presence. She could no longer deny that their bond was much more than just friendship, but at the same time she didn't know how to deal with it. Lisa found herself thinking more and more often about what her future with Josh would be like. What if she could leave Mark and start all over again with a man who understood her, who made her happy? But despite all these dreams and fantasies, something inside her prevented her from taking this decisive step. There were too many obstacles: Mark, long years of marriage, guilt and fear of the unknown. And besides, she wasn't sure what Josh wanted. Every day, her inner conflict became more unbearable. Lisa knew she had to talk to Josh and find out how he saw their relationship. She needed to know how he felt in order to figure out how to build her life further. She could not continue to live in this limbo, being between two men, each of whom played an important role in her life. One day, after a particularly stressful day, Lisa decided that she couldn't put this conversation off any longer. She called Josh and asked to meet, without telling him anything specific, but making sure that he understood that it was important. They agreed to meet in the park, in the very place where they once walked as teenagers. At that moment, Lisa realized that she wanted to return the feeling of carelessness that they had then, but she understood that this was impossible. When they met, Lisa felt this indescribable tension building up inside her again. Josh, as usual, was calm, but there was something in his eyes that told her that he too felt that their relationship had long since crossed the line beyond which there was no way back. They started with the usual conversations about life, acquaintances and work, but Lisa couldn't keep it to herself anymore. She resolutely brought up the topic of their relationship, told him about her feelings, about how she was tormented by this contradiction between duty and desire. Lisa thought Josh would understand her, that he felt the same way too, but his reaction surprised her. He didn't answer right away, and at that moment Lisa realized that his silence meant more than any words. In the following days, their relationship began to change rapidly. Josh began to move away from Lisa. If before he was the source of her joy and comfort, now every meeting with him brought her pain and disappointment. He was no longer the Josh who brought lightness to her life. Coldness and aloofness appeared in his behavior. Lisa didn't understand what was going on, but she felt that he was avoiding her. Her heart ached with the fear of losing him. Josh began to write less often, skipping their meetings, referring to work or other business. Lisa didn't know how to handle it. She tried to talk to him about what was going on, but every time she brought it up, he evaded the question, found excuses, or simply remained silent. That silence hit her harder than any words. Lisa felt increasingly lonely. Now that her marriage to Mark had effectively ended, she realized that she was left alone, without the support she had found in Josh for so long. She couldn't believe that he could give up on her so easily. It seemed unfair. They had been through so much together, and Lisa couldn't accept the fact that their bond, which seemed so strong to her, could end like this without explanation and without saying goodbye. Every day without Josh seemed painful to her. She couldn't think of anything else but why he had changed, why he didn't want to be around her anymore. Lisa tried to get back to her normal life, but everything reminded her of Josh. Things, places, even random phrases in conversations with people, all this made her think about him. She knew she had gone too far, that her life would never be the same again, but she didn't know how to deal with it. The time they spent together now seemed distant and ghostly to her, like a dream that shouldn't have become reality. A few weeks later, Lisa made the final decision to talk to Josh. She needed to hear the truth from him, no matter how painful it turned out to be. She couldn't live in this state of uncertainty anymore. She made an appointment with him, but to her disappointment, Josh started avoiding the conversation again. He came to the meeting, but he behaved coldly and restrained, as if nothing had ever happened between them. At that moment, Lisa realized that their relationship was over. Josh was no longer the kind of person she could be honest and open with. She lost him the same way she had lost Mark, only this time it was even more painful because she was hoping for something more. Her whole life, all her plans for the future were connected with him, and now those dreams have crumbled to dust. Lisa left the meeting feeling devastated. Her heart was broken, and she didn't know how to move on. Her relationship with Mark was ruined, and now she's lost Josh too. She was left alone with pain that seemed unbearable. Lisa couldn't believe that everything she had been through had led to such an outcome. She hoped for a new life, for love, but in the end she lost everything that was important to her. Now all she had to do was accept that her life would never be the same again. Josh became for her the person who awakened her feelings, but also the one who left her alone with those feelings without offering any solution. She could no longer rely on anyone but herself, and this realization was the hardest. Lisa spent her days thinking about what could have gone wrong. She tried to analyze every moment of their relationship, every conversation, every meeting. What did she do wrong? Why did Josh, who was so important to her, suddenly turn away from her? These questions haunted her, but there were no answers. Lisa felt that her life had now turned into a series of meaningless days, devoid of joy and hope. A few more weeks passed, and Lisa realized that Josh was leaving her life. His absence has become permanent. He no longer wrote, called, or offered to meet. She understood that this was the end, and every day her heart became more resigned to this fact, although the pain did not go away. Lisa realized that she had to accept this and move on, but she didn't know how. Everything that connected her to the past was now destroyed. Her life seemed to be plunged into darkness. Lisa didn't see the point of anything anymore. She had lost both her husband and her lover, and with them herself. Every morning began with her forcing herself out of bed, but there was no joy or hope in her actions. Everything that once seemed important to her has now lost its meaning. However, despite all the pain and disappointment, Lisa knew that she would have to find the strength to continue living. Her heart was broken, but she understood that time had to heal her wounds. She couldn't rely on Josh or Mark anymore. Now she had to rebuild her life, without them, without these men who had caused her suffering. The healing process was long and painful. Lisa slowly learned to accept reality for what it is. She no longer expected miracles from life, but she also realized that she could not let her grief completely consume her. Gradually, day by day, she began to find the strength to move on. Her path to a new beginning was difficult, but she knew it was the only path she had now. The conflict with Josh was Lisa's moment of realization that she could no longer rely on other people for her happiness. Now she had to search for him inside herself, and although it was difficult, she realized that there was no other way out. Lisa was left alone, but she knew that this was not the end, but only the beginning of her new path. Ever since Lisa and Josh crossed that invisible boundary, their lives seemed to have gone downhill. Each of their new contacts was riddled with tension that could no longer be ignored. At first, they tried to act as if nothing had happened. Their meetings resembled rituals of the past conversations about old friends, light jokes, memories of childhood. But there was no longer the ease that had been there before. Every time they were near, the air became heavy, full of unexpressed feelings and silent confessions. Lisa knew that her relationship with Josh would never be the same again. She was immersed in this connection, which now, after they crossed the line, became for her a source of excruciating pleasure and pain at the same time. Her life turned into a constant struggle with her own emotions. She tried to find solace in these rare meetings with Josh, but they only deepened her inner conflict. Her marriage to Mark had collapsed, and now only Josh was left, but with him, too, things were getting more complicated and confusing. Every time Josh came to their house, Lisa couldn't help but feel this strange tension. He stayed the night, but now his presence in the house became even more difficult for her. Mark, as usual, was immersed in his own affairs, and often did not even notice how long Josh stayed with them. For him, Josh was a friend, a part of their past, and he did not suspect that their friendship had long ago turned into something much more. But Lisa felt on the edge, as if her life was about to collapse completely. One night, when Josh stayed with them again, Lisa couldn't sleep. She was lying in bed next to Mark, listening to his calm breathing, but her thoughts were far from him. All day she had been trying to ignore the tension that was growing by the hour, but now, in the silence of the night, it became unbearable. Lisa felt like she couldn't keep it to herself anymore. She knew Josh was in the living room, whether he was asleep or just lying in the dark, thinking like she was. Lisa got out of bed and quietly left the bedroom, trying not to wake Mark. She walked to the living room door, her heart racing. In the darkness of the room, Josh's outline could be seen lying on the couch. Lisa stopped on the threshold, feeling an indescribable tension engulf her. She couldn't explain why she took this step, why she was attracted to him, but at that moment she couldn't stop. The silence was deafening. Lisa stood there, not daring to come closer, but at the same time she couldn't leave. Something inside her was breaking. All her moral principles, duty, guilt, all this receded into the background. At that moment, only one thing was important to her: to be near him, to feel his presence, which became for her a source of strange comfort and at the same time fear. She knew that this step would change everything, that their relationship would no longer be the same, but she couldn't stop herself. She came closer, feeling her breathing become ragged. 1,000 thoughts swarmed through her head: that she was betraying Mark, that Josh might not feel the same way about her, that their friendship, which they had cherished for so long, was now destroyed. But despite all these thoughts, she was attracted to him, and she couldn't do anything about it. Josh was her salvation and her curse at the same time. He was the one who brought her back to life when she felt cornered by her own problems and disappointments. But at the same time, he became the cause of her inner rupture, which now could not be ignored. Lisa knew that if she took another step, she would never be able to return to her old life. She stopped in front of the sofa, feeling her heart about to jump out of her chest. Josh didn't move, but Lisa knew he wasn't asleep. There was a silence between them, filled with all the things they couldn't say out loud. She felt this tension on a physical level. It was pressing on her, making her breathe heavily and unevenly. It was a tension that they had both felt over the past few months, but which could not find a way out. That night was a turning point for Lisa. She couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. Her feelings for Josh overwhelmed her, and she couldn't fight it. Her life, which had been full of uncertainty and suffering until that moment, now turned into a maze from which there was no way out. She was trapped in this triangle between Mark and Josh, and each new day only brought her more pain. After that night, everything changed. Josh became even more distant. He no longer came as often as he used to, and if he did, their conversations became even more strained. Lisa didn't know how to trust him now. She felt that something had broken between them. The lightness they felt at the beginning disappeared, giving way to a heavy silence that increasingly corroded their relationship. Every time Lisa was alone, her thoughts went back to that night. She felt crushed. Her relationship with Mark had been doomed for a long time, but now she realized that things were not so simple with Josh either. She couldn't look at him as a friend anymore, but at the same time, she didn't know what to do with what had arisen between them. Their connection, which seemed so meaningful to her, has now become a source of excruciating suffering for her. It's been a few weeks. Lisa tried to avoid Josh, but every time they were around, there was that same tension between them that they both felt but couldn't put into words. Their meetings became rare, and each time they ended in silence that spoke more than any words. Lisa understood that their friendship had long ceased to exist. In its place, there was only this heavy, inevitable attraction that she could not suppress. Mark, as usual, did not notice what was going on inside Lisa. He was immersed in his work, in his problems, and Lisa realized that she had not been an important part of his life for a long time. He lived in his own world, and she lived in hers. They were two strangers who happened to be under the same roof. Lisa tried to get back to her usual life, but every time she thought about Josh, her heart broke. One night Lisa couldn't sleep again. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and felt a growing sense of unease inside her. It was the same feeling she felt every time she thought about Josh. She couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. She needed to change something, but she didn't know where to start. Lisa understood that she could no longer continue her relationship with Josh in this form, but at the same time she did not know how to live without him. That night was the beginning of the end for Lisa. She realized that she couldn't ignore her feelings anymore, but she couldn't be with Josh either. She was crushed by this conflict which was tearing her apart. She felt trapped between the past and the present, between duty and desire. And every day this trap got closer and closer. In the following days, Lisa no longer tried to find solace in Josh. She avoided him, didn't answer his calls and texts. She needed time to sort herself out, to figure out what she really wanted. But there was still this feeling inside of her that wouldn't let her rest. She knew that her life would never be the same again, that her relationship with Mark was already over, and with Josh it would never start the way she wanted it to. This night meeting became a point of no return for Lisa. She couldn't go back to what she was before anymore. Her life had been ruined, and now she had to put herself back together, but she didn't know how to do it. When Lisa first crossed the line between friendship and something more with Josh, she knew it would inevitably change her life. However, she could not predict how devastating the consequences of this betrayal would be. At first, it seemed to her like a passing infatuation, a way to escape from the suffocating routine and emotional emptiness of her marriage to Mark. But the deeper Lisa got into her relationship with Josh, the more her life began to fall apart. At first, Lisa tried to keep everything under control, convincing herself that this was a temporary crisis. She thought she could handle the situation, that her marriage to Mark could still be saved if she just pretended that nothing had happened. At one point, she even believed that she could bring back her old feelings for Mark and close the door to the past, which was increasingly associated with Josh. But as the days passed, reality became increasingly grim and unforgiving. After that night with Josh, Lisa noticed that her behavior with Mark had changed. She couldn't look at him with the same tenderness anymore, couldn't touch him without feeling guilty. Every time Mark tried to get close to her, whether it was a conversation or ordinary household chores, she felt that an invisible wall had grown between them. Her heart no longer responded to his touch. Now all her thoughts were on Josh, what had happened between them, and what could have happened. Lisa began to avoid Mark, becoming more and more immersed in her own thoughts and feelings. She found various excuses to spend less time together. If earlier they had at least tried to maintain the appearance of a normal life, now Lisa was more and more withdrawn into herself. The evenings they used to spend together became filled with painful silence. Lisa was no longer interested in what was going on in Mark's life, and he, in turn, seemed not to notice her inner struggle. Her breakup with him had been a slow, painful process that had been going on for months, but now it was obvious even to herself. Every morning, waking up next to Mark, Lisa felt a strange heaviness in her soul. Her thoughts were full of contradictions. On the one hand, she couldn't forgive herself for betraying him, but on the other, she couldn't ignore her feelings for Josh. Every day began with a struggle with myself, with trying to convince myself that this was just a temporary confusion, that everything would get better soon. But the more she tried to convince herself of this, the more intense her inner tension became. Mark didn't seem to suspect anything. He was still as engrossed in his work as before. Sometimes he stayed late at the office or at meetings with colleagues, and sometimes he returned home late at night when Lisa was already asleep. Their conversations boiled down to simple, mundane things: shopping, weekend plans, household issues. But Lisa understood that she could no longer support this farce. She felt empty, crushed by internal conflicts. The longer her secret relationship with Josh continued, the more she realized that she had lost control of the situation. Initially, everything seemed so simple. She just wanted to feel alive, to regain those emotions that were missing in her marriage with Mark. But now everything has become more complicated. Josh had become more than just a comfort or a romantic intrigue for her. Her feelings for him were getting deeper and deeper, but at the same time they were causing her more and more pain. Josh also began to notice the changes in Lisa. He could feel her inner struggle, her doubts. Although they didn't talk about it directly, the silence between them became even more difficult. Lisa didn't know how to tell him about her fears, that she felt torn in two. She could no longer enjoy their meetings, because behind every moment of joy there was an unbearable weight of guilt in front of Mark. Over time, Lisa began to realize that her relationship with Josh was also going through a crisis. If before they could easily communicate, now their every conversation was full of innuendo and hidden feelings. Lisa noticed how Josh began to avoid her. He was no longer the same as before. Their meetings became less frequent, and his behavior became more restrained. Lisa couldn't understand what was happening to him. It seemed to her that he also felt guilty about what had happened between them, but did not know how to deal with it. One evening, Lisa returned home and realized that she could no longer live like this. She sat alone in the living room for a long time, thinking that her life had turned into an endless series of sufferings. Her marriage to Mark was effectively dead, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Her relationship with Josh was also becoming more and more painful, but she couldn't let him go. Lisa found herself in a trap from which she saw no way out. The consequences of treason began to manifest themselves in everything. Lisa began to lose control not only of her feelings, but also of her life in general. She began to sleep worse. She was tormented by constant nightmares in which she saw Mark and Josh together and could not choose which of them she should leave in her life. She became distracted, forgetful, unable to focus on anything. Even the simplest household chores irritated her. Over time, Lisa began to notice that Mark began to look at her more closely. Perhaps he suspected something, but did not dare to ask a direct question. He asked her more and more often about her day, how she was feeling. But Lisa couldn't tell him the truth. Each of his questions seemed to her like a trap that she could fall into if she answered incorrectly. She tried to avoid these conversations, but it was getting harder every day. Mark, despite his immersion in work, began to notice that their relationship had changed. He tried to get closer to Lisa, but she pulled away from him in every possible way. He saw her closeness, her coldness, but did not understand what caused such a change. Sometimes Mark tried to arrange a romantic dinner or offered to spend the weekend together, but Lisa refused, citing fatigue or other business. She couldn't be around him anymore, knowing that she had betrayed him. One of the most painful moments for Lisa was the realization that she had lost not only Mark, but also Josh. If before he had been a source of joy and comfort to her, now their meetings have become painful for her. Josh began to appear less and less in her life, and every time they saw each other, Lisa felt that their relationship no longer brought her joy. He became even more distant, and Lisa understood that he did not see a future for their relationship either. After one of their rare dates, Lisa realized that she could no longer continue this relationship. She couldn't be with Josh, but she couldn't go back to Mark either. Her life had completely lost its meaning. She felt crushed, didn't know how to move on. Everything she did seemed empty and meaningless to her. Her job, her home, her relationships, all this has become something alien and unnecessary for her. Lisa understood that she needed to make some kind of decision. She could no longer remain in this state of uncertainty, but the fear of the unknown paralyzed her. She was afraid to ruin her life completely, but she understood that if she did not change anything, she would die in this mental anguish. Every day was a challenge for her. Every evening she spent alone, thinking about what had gone wrong. There came a moment when Lisa realized that she needed to talk to Mark. She couldn't live a lie anymore. She needed to confess to him what had happened, even if it would ruin their marriage completely. Lisa knew he deserved the truth, and she couldn't take it any longer. But no matter how hard she tried to prepare for this conversation, something stopped her every time. She was afraid to see his reaction, afraid of his anger, disappointment, pain. When she finally decided to talk, there was a strange feeling of emptiness inside her. She knew that this conversation would be the end of their life together, but at the same time she felt strangely relieved at the thought that she would no longer have to lie. She had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and now it seemed inevitable to her. That evening was the hardest for Lisa in her life. She gathered all her strength to finally tell Mark the truth, but his reaction was even more painful than she expected. The moment that Lisa had been dreading for so long had arrived. She could no longer hide behind the daily routine and pretend that nothing was happening. Her life was slowly falling apart, and she realized that she simply couldn't stay in this lie anymore. The internal conflict that had been gnawing at her over the past months had reached its climax. Everything she had so carefully hidden from Mark had now come out, and she had to face the consequences of her choice. Lisa has been putting off this moment for a long time. She was afraid of destroying not only her marriage, but everything that she and Mark had built together. The memories of how happy they had been at the beginning of their relationship tormented her like ghosts of the past, from which it was impossible to escape. But now those memories seemed distant and alien, as if she was no longer the woman who had once loved Mark. Everything had changed, and Lisa could no longer ignore the truth. Her relationship with Josh, which had once seemed like a source of comfort and new sensations, now brought her only pain and disappointment. They crossed the boundaries of friendship, and it changed everything. Josh was no longer that easy, joyful person with whom you could just relax and forget about problems. His presence in her life was a reminder that she had betrayed Mark, betrayed their marriage, and now she would have to pay for her mistakes. Lisa felt that she had lost not only Mark but Josh as well. They both drifted away from her, leaving her alone with painful thoughts. All this time, Lisa was trying to cope with the guilt that was eating her up from the inside. She knew that her actions had led to the destruction of their marriage, but she couldn't figure out how to deal with this feeling. A storm was raging inside her, which did not abate for a minute. Her life became a series of sleepless nights and painful thoughts. She couldn't hide her feelings anymore, but at the same time she didn't know how to tell Mark the truth. One evening, when Mark returned home, Lisa realized that she could no longer put off this conversation. She sat in the kitchen, thinking about how to start, but the words wouldn't come. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed like she was about to lose consciousness. Lisa knew that this conversation would be the end of everything she knew, the end of their marriage, the end of her old life. Mark looked tired, as he always did after a long day at work. He didn't notice her tense state, just walked past her, ignoring her. It was an ordinary evening for them, full of silence and alienation. Lisa stared at him for a long time, trying to gather the strength to finally tell the truth, but fear held her back. She was afraid of his reaction, afraid that this conversation would ruin not only their marriage, but also their lives. Her thoughts went back to Josh, to how it all started. These meetings with him seemed so innocent to her at first, almost accidental. She sought solace in him, wanting to find in his presence something she had not found in Mark for a long time. But this relationship grew into something more, and Lisa couldn't handle it anymore. Josh became a source of joy and pain for her at the same time. Now his absence from her life tormented her, but at the same time she understood that everything ended with him the same way as with Mark. Lisa took a deep breath and finally decided to have this conversation. Her voice trembled as she started to speak, but she knew there was no other way out. She told Mark everything. Her confession was excruciating. She could feel her heart tearing apart with every word, but she couldn't stop. Everything she was hiding came out. Mark listened to her in silence, without interrupting, but his face changed as she talked. Lisa saw how his eyes had dimmed, how his features had become stony, and his breathing was ragged. She knew this conversation would hurt him, but she couldn't lie anymore. She couldn't go on living this lie anymore. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Lisa waited for his reaction, but Mark didn't say a word. His face remained impenetrable, but in his eyes Lisa saw what she feared most of all: disappointment and emptiness. He got up from the table and went into the bedroom, leaving her alone in the kitchen. Lisa sat in place for a long time, not knowing what to do. She understood that this moment was the end of their marriage. The next morning, Mark packed up his things and left. He didn't say a word. Lisa knew it was his decision, and she couldn't stop him. She was left alone in their empty house, realizing that now her life would never be the same. Everything they had built together, all their years of marriage, all their plans for the future, it was all ruined. Lisa understood that she would no longer be able to return to the life they had led together. Now she had to live alone, and this realization was both frightening and liberating for her. In the first days after Mark left, Lisa felt lost. She wandered around the house, not knowing what to do. Things that used to bring her joy now seemed meaningless. Every corner of the house reminded her of Mark, of what she had destroyed. Her heart was heavy with guilt, and Lisa didn't know how to deal with this feeling. She often looked at the phone, hoping that Josh would call or text, but he also disappeared from her life. Josh, upon learning that Lisa confessed to Mark, began to distance himself even more from her. He didn't want to be the reason for the destruction of her marriage, and this realization weighed on him. Lisa felt that she had lost not only her husband, but also Josh. He had become a part of her past that she could no longer bring back. She was left alone, and this loneliness scared her. Every day Lisa realized more and more that her life should be different now. Her marriage to Mark ended, and with it ended most of the life she had known. She could no longer live in the past, but the future seemed unclear and frightening to her. Lisa realized that now she would have to start all over again, but did not know how to do it. Her loneliness has become a new challenge for her. It took Lisa a long time to come to terms with the fact that she was left alone. She spent days in silence, thinking about what had happened, what had brought her to this moment. She tried to find answers to her questions, but each time she came to the same conclusion: her decisions led to the destruction of her life, and now she will have to live with these consequences. Lisa realized that her life would never be the same again. She lost Mark, she lost Josh, but most importantly, she lost herself. Everything she knew about herself now seemed alien and unnecessary to her. Her old life, her dreams, her plans, all this is in the past. Now there was only a void in front of her, which she had to fill anew. It took several months before Lisa began to rebuild herself. She was gradually getting used to her new status as a woman who had lost everything. Her life became different, but with it came the realization that she was now free. Lisa was no longer tied to the past, to obligations to Mark, or feelings for Josh. Now she had to build a new life. Lisa began to seek solace in simple things: long walks in the fresh air, reading books that she had been putting off for a long time, and meeting friends whom she had not seen for a long time. She knew it would take time to recover, but it was her way. She needed to learn to live anew, without attachment to the people who used to make up her world. Over time, Lisa realized that her life, despite all the destruction, is still full of possibilities. She no longer felt obligated to anyone, and it gave her a sense of lightness. Her future was full of uncertainty, but with it, prospects. Lisa realized that now she can build her life anew, on her own terms, without fear of what happened in the past. The denouement of her relationship with Mark and Josh was a painful but necessary lesson for Lisa. Now she knew that she could not build her happiness on lies or betrayal. She had to go through losses to realize that her real strength was inside herself. And now that everything was over, Lisa was ready to start a new chapter in her life, filled with awareness of her own mistakes and willingness to change.